Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to the University of Texas at Arlington. Thank you for coming. I'm Ken Williford, the chair of the Department of Philosophy and Humanities. Tonight we have a very good show for you. I'm pleased that two student organizations, Faith and Answers and the Liberation Coalition, have come together to co-sponsor this event with the Department of Philosophy and Humanities. It's a debate on animal suffering and the Christian faith. We should also thank Alan Hainline for some financial support for this event. So before I turn it over to Mason Kelso of Faith and Answers, who'll be our moderator for tonight, I'll just make a couple of general remarks and introduce the speakers. I just want to note, in the way of general remarks, how important events like these are these days. I don't need to remind everyone just how polarized and treacherous things have become in this period of interregnum, as Gramsci calls it, that we find ourselves in. We need a lot of reminders these days that people of very different persuasions can still come together, talk to one another civilly, reason with one another, and be genuinely open to having their opinions changed. Events like this show that that's still possible. We may have some fireworks. Debates are boring without them, of course. And minds may not be changed by the end of the night. But if everyone here is committed to following the arguments wherever they lead, to rationality and civility, then we're all at least on some of the same pages. So first, I'll introduce Dr. John Ferrer. He's an educator and minister hailing from the great state of Iowa. He's earned degrees in religion, communication, Christian apologetics, and finally his PhD in the philosophy of religion from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth. John's published in apologetics journals and magazines. He's taught at the high school and undergraduate levels, as well as in churches, conferences, and various special events all over the country and the world. Currently, John and his wife, Hillary Morgan Ferrer, founder of Mama Bear Apologetics, live in Pella, Iowa. John has debated the likes of Zach Moore. I think I just met Zach Moore, of the Fellowship of Free Thought, David Smalley of Dogma Debate, as well as Matt Dillahunty. And here at UTA, he represented the pro-life position in a panel debate with our very own Charles Hermes and Sally Parker Ryan. A fun fact about John is that he once taught a lesson at one of St. Thomas Aquinas' universities, the University of Naples, and got mugged on the street afterwards. I guess that's fun. Yeah. And some well-known YouTuber who goes under the name Skydivephil. I have that written down. His channel has had more than 2.5 million views. After receiving an undergraduate degree in economics from the University of Manchester and a master's in financial economics from the University of Southampton, Phil had a successful career in the world of finance, but eventually he went back to education and studied astronomy at University College London. Having completed his project on early universe cosmology, he made that the focus of his YouTube channel and has interviewed some of the leading scientists in the field, including Stephen Hawking, Sir Roger Penrose, Alan Guth, and many others. Some of his other videos have critiqued famous Christian apologists for misrepresenting scientific research, and his video on animal suffering, featuring many leading neuroscientists, has led to much controversy, including 3 appearances on a number of on the #1 religious debate podcast on iTunes, Unbelievable. Unbelievable?
Unbelievable.
Okay. Got a question. The show's Christian host admitted only one case in 10 years of discussion when an atheist got him to change his mind, and that was Phil's case for the multiverse. Phil has authored material with string theorist Ali Nayeri and is currently working on a paper with yours truly, the neuroscientist David Rudroff, and the psychologist neuroscientist Barry Fuchs on animal suffering. Fun fact, although Phil has made more than 1,300 sky dives and won a gold medal at the UK National Skydiving Championships, he's still terrified of heights. About facing your fear again and again and again.
So we're going to do 20-minute introduction arguments. We're going to start with Phil, and then we're going to give 20 minutes to Dr. Ferrer, and then they'll have a 10-minute response period each. And then we'll go ahead and do a cross-examination that's going to last roughly 45 minutes. We're going to have 4 different questions, 2 that they've chosen. And if we want to go into, if we have any extra time, we'll go ahead and go into those. But I don't want to waste any more time. And then we'll have a Q&A after.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'd also like to thank Mason for organising the debate, John for agreeing to it, Ken, and Ken and I are working on this paper on animal suffering. So why should animal suffering cause you to reject the Christian God? Well, the reason is quite simple. Such a God is supposed to be all-powerful and all-loving, so he should want to stop suffering, and he should be able to. But he hasn't stopped suffering. Now, this, I'm sure, is a familiar argument. But why focus on animal suffering? Well, the Christians think they have good responses to the standard problem of suffering. These are known as theodicies. But when we focus on non-human animals, which are simply called animals from now on, what we find is that these theodicies won't work. Now, I don't think they work with humans either, but let's set that aside for the moment. Let's think about one of the many ways in which animals suffer in the wild. Consider an animal wandering into a tar pit. What happens? Well, they get stuck and they die. Now, I want you to imagine yourself, or maybe a loved one, being stuck in a tar pit, unable to get out, probably starving to death. Pretty horrific, right? But the horrors have only just begun. What happens next is that other animals now see what they think is an easy meal, and then they get stuck too. At the La Brea tar pits in California, there are the remains of 4,000 direwolves that died in this way. No, direwolves are not just from Game of Thrones. And there were many other animals that died there too, and other tar pits, and of course many other horrendous ways that animals suffer in nature. Now, one might of course wonder, why didn't God give animals the instinct to avoid such horrible fates? It would be easy for God to do that, or for him to give predators analgesics in their teeth so that their prey suffer less. Now, John has mentioned elsewhere that some animals die quickly when consumed by a predator, but many others die slowly. It would be easy for God to make us all vegetarians. John has said this would not work, as grazing animals would consume too much grass and the ecosystem would collapse. But God could just lessen their appetite or give them more resources. How about photosynthetic skin? Christian philosopher Michael Murray has suggested that God might have given us infinite resources and then no one would have to die. But he also said that infinite resources are impossible because we'd be squashed by their gravity. So modern physics has revealed why God could not have done this. But Murray is just wrong about physics. If you have an infinite amount of stuff in one direction and it's balanced by an infinite amount of stuff in another direction, then the net gravitational force is 0. And this isn't the only thing prominent Christian philosophers are wrong about, as we'll see. And why couldn't have God made us vegetarians? We kill billions of animals per year for food, which is causing one of the worst mass extinction events ever seen on the planet. God could stop this by disabling our ability to metabolize meat. Or maybe he could have at least made bacon not taste quite so nice. As one of God's chosen people, and as a vegetarian myself now, this is something I've really had to struggle with. Now, God has done none of these things. And I think the simplest explanation for that is that he doesn't exist. But let's go back to our tar pit example. How do the traditional theodicies fare? Well, one argument is that God, favours free will. So he doesn't want to interfere with free will. But what's this to do with death by tar pit? Nothing. Tar pits form naturally. So this theodicy is not going to work. Another theodicy is that God allows suffering so that we can develop qualities like courage or forgiveness. But in this case, the animals don't really have any way to rescue one another or themselves, so how is this relevant? Even if animals understand forgiveness, who are they going to forgive? Again, tar pits are a natural phenomenon. Now, elsewhere, John has said he's read dozens of Christian authors on this subject, and they explain suffering through Adam and Eve. Their sin brought death and suffering into the world. The humans were additionally punished by being chucked out of the Garden of Eden, and the snake was punished by having it and all of its descendants have to crawl on their bellies. And as the British comedian Ricky Gervais said, this isn't much of a punishment for a snake, is it? And now, this sort of narrative is known as a full theodicy or Augustinian theodicy. But what St. Augustine didn't know, but we do, is that science has revealed to us that animals have been suffering for hundreds of millions of years before the first humans ever walked the earth. And this one simple fact totally undermines what John claims is the dominant Christian theodicy. What's more is that science has also shown us that other animals have a sort of proto-morality. And this strongly suggests that our sense of right and wrong, like our physical bodies, has evolved. And it wasn't something we got from eating a single piece of fruit tempted to us by a talking snake. Now, some Christians, like John, realise that the original full story that's actually in the book of Genesis won't work. Yeah, if only they had a chance to rewrite it. So they give us a second full story. You know what God meant to say. That is, before humans ever existed, Satan sinned. And this brought animal suffering into the world. It's a sort of prequel. And as we all know, prequels tend to be unsatisfying. And this explanation is certainly that. Now, why isn't this in Genesis? I think John needs to explain why the Old Testament authors forgot to mention this incredibly important event. A further problem is that, again, science has shown us that we got here via a process of evolution. Evolution is cruel and nasty. As John has said on his blog, nature is a wandering, mindless, heartless, silent, stone-cold killer boss machine. Nature is a jerk. But according to Christianity, God is the author of nature. So what does that make him? And if catastrophic events like the impact that probably killed off the dinosaurs didn't happen, we most likely probably wouldn't be here. And this awful violence is the very engine of our creation. Now, if the fall of Satan is responsible for animal suffering before the fall, then that makes Satan the author of our creation. So this puts theologians in a terrible bind. They either have to, one, deny the science, or two, accept the science and give up the idea that God created us, or three, embrace the science, but that would give us a God that uses asteroid impacts and terrible violence to get to us, or four, claim that the cruelty of nature is down to the devil, but that makes the devil the author of our creation. So a further problem is that good designers build redundancy into their system. They allow for failure and make sure their systems won't go down as a result. Is that video playing? Right. Okay, but a world of perhaps trillions of organisms that all have to suffer because of the bad decisions of one or a few individuals, that shows no redundancy. What's more is that God is supposed to be able to see the future, so he knows that his system is going to fail, and yet he does nothing to stop it. This makes God to be a terribly bad designer or criminally negligent. Why didn't he just kill Satan? God kills lots of people all throughout the Bible. So why not Satan? Maybe he feels he needs a scapegoat to blame for all the suffering he fails to prevent. But animal suffering isn't limited to that which God refuses to prevent. He also commands great suffering. Consider 1 Samuel. God says, "Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass." Now, I found it very sad and very telling about the dark side of human nature that an intelligent and I'm sure educated person and caring person can give a justification for this genocide. But that's what theologians do all the time. Now, John has said that people massacred deserve what they got because they sinned against Israel. Now, let's put aside how this is supposed to apply to the children that were killed. How can it possibly apply to the animals? And if God had good reason to kill the animals, why not do so painlessly? Instead, he had his soldiers kill them with their swords. Let's give another example. In Joshua 11:6, we see that God commands Joshua to hough their horses and burn their chariots with fire. Now, I know nothing about horses, so I had to look up what this meant. And what to hough means is to sever the Achilles tendon of the animal so as to immobilize it. Now, imagine what a horrific experience this is for the horse. If God is omnipotent, he could have immobilized them for the duration of the battle painlessly. He could have just broken the wheels of the chariots without harming the horses, but no, he chose this horrible torture. God also, of course, asked for animal sacrifices. Why? But the problem isn't limited to the suffering that God commands of others, but also includes the suffering that God directly inflicts on animals. When he killed the firstborn Egyptians, he didn't just limit it to the people, but also their animals. And the Bible gives us an explanation as to why he did this. He wants to show off his power. Consider the great flood. God kills almost every living thing on earth with a flood that lasts 40 days and nights. Presumably the weakest would have died first. Mothers would watch their children being killed. Now, God could have used a quick and painless method, but he didn't. And why did he carry out such an awful massacre? Because he was displeased with his creation. Now, if it was just man's wickedness, that displeased him, why kill all the animals? If God was displeased with the animals, why did he create them in the first place? And if this violence was necessary to wipe the slate clean, why save a pair of every animal? Because then you're just left with what you started with. So not only is his action brutal, but it's also pointless. After all, sin didn't go away, suffering didn't go away, violence didn't go away. The same animals that God nearly wiped out are now back. And if you think the New Testament is devoid of this brutality, consider the story where Jesus is involved with the exorcism of a demonic spirit. And I quote, the herd of pigs then ran violently down a steep place into the sea and perished in the waters. About 2,000 animals were killed according to the Gospel of Mark. Now, why couldn't have Jesus exorcised evil spirits straight into the sea and skipped the death of the pigs? Now, in light of all these difficulties, theologians have been forced to more and more desperate measures. One strategy is called neo-Cartesianism, which is a view that animals don't really have morally significant suffering. Amazingly, this has been supported by prominent theologians such as C.S. Lewis, Peter Harrison, John Hick, and more recently Hick's former student, William Lane Craig. Craig is one of the more recent versions of this line of argument, so let's quote him about what he says about whether animals are aware of their pain. He says, for that sort of pain awareness requires self-awareness. And this is centered in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, a section of the brain that is missing in all animals except for the higher primates and human beings. And therefore, even though animals are in pain, they aren't aware of it. This discovery magnifies the mercy and goodness of God. God has shielded almost the entire animal kingdom throughout its history from an awareness of being in pain. For those of us who are pet owners and lovers of animals, this is a tremendous comfort and a cause of praise of God for his goodness and wondrous, even ingenious care of creation. Now, the technical term that philosophers use for this type of argument is that it is nonsense. Now, although John might not be a neo-Cartesian, he has said human beings are distinguished from the rest of the animal kingdom in large part by their prefrontal cortex. Now, it's just not true that the prefrontal cortex is only found in higher primates. Here is an image from a textbook on the prefrontal cortex, and you'll see that other animals have them too. Ken Williford here has worked on a paper with neuroscientists who examined a patient with his prefrontal cortex effectively destroyed, and his self-awareness was perfectly intact. Moreover, his pain perception seemed worse than normal. So this line of argument is rendered completely dubious. The idea came from a clinical study of lobotomy patients that apparently said they didn't mind their pain. But of course, these patients had to be self-aware in order to say that. And when one looks at the details, it wasn't that they said they didn't mind pain, they did. It was their anxiety about their chronic pain, which was lessened by the procedure. One reason we know this is that they still felt pain, is that they said so, and they took analgesics for them. And animals do the same thing. They will give up their normal preferences in order to consume analgesics in a painful situation. Note that Bill Craig thinks that animals have been shielded from pain, something he thinks shows off the glory and ingenuity of God. And maybe it would, if it were true. But it's not true. Animals haven't been shielded from pain, even though they could have been. And so what does that say about the glory and ingenuity of God? Now, one tactic used by John and others is to admit that suffering counts as evidence against God, but to claim that we have other evidence in favour of God. And in a recent debate, he cited the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, and the moral argument. Now, I won't have time to go into these in details. Feel free to ask me about them afterwards. The cosmological argument is a dubious argument because we don't really know that the universe had a beginning. And I've interviewed many of the world's leading cosmologists. This is just no longer the view. It's based on outdated science. And even if it did have a beginning, it doesn't follow that an immaterial mind began it. The fine-tuning argument is dubious because we don't really know the universe is fine-tuned or that God implies a fine-tuned universe. And if it is fine-tuned, well, out of the options theologians give us, necessity, chance, or design by immaterial mind, the only one with any empirical evidence in favour of it is chance. Ask me about this afterwards and I'll explain in more detail. And the moral argument is bad because we really don't know that morality is objective. Objective means to be independent of mind, but it's not clear that moral statements can have this quality. Unlike statements about, say, the relative size of planets or mountains, things we can agree are objective. Now, even if morality is objective, it doesn't follow that God makes it objective. After all, God is supposed to be a mind. And there's many more things wrong with these arguments. Again, we can explore them later. But even if these are good arguments, none of them show that the Christian God is true. Moreover, just like we only need one case of a black swan to falsify the statement that all swans are white. So we only need one case of unnecessary suffering to disprove the existence of an all-powerful, all-loving God. Now, another way out theologians have explored, and John has advocated in his previous debates, is to appeal to God's inscrutability. For all we know, all the hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering is really necessary. There's a good reason for it, but we just don't know what it is. This is also known as skeptical theism, but it's also a skepticism that is conveniently selective, focusing on whether we would know unnecessary suffering when we see it. But why not be skeptical that we would know a true revelation from God if we see it? How do we know the Bible isn't from the devil? Or maybe from advanced aliens? Or maybe they wanted to create a religion for their astrosociology research. But if you really took skeptical theism seriously, then why try to end any suffering? For all we know, any crime we stop or disease that we treat could be stopping some greater good that God has in mind. But of course, we do think intervening to stop suffering is a good thing. That's because if we see no evidence that suffering is necessary, then we assume it isn't and we intervene. We have to go with the evidence that we have. And in assessing whether the claim of an all-powerful and all-good God is true or false, we also have to go with the evidence that we have. And if you take skeptical theism seriously, how can you say rape, murder, or torture, genocide are ultimately wrong? After all, God might have a good reason for them that you just don't know. Now, skeptical theism undermines Christianity in many more ways. Consider this. What if I told you that the Bible was given to us by a God to test our morality? He wants you to condemn the awful genocide and the cruelty to animals and praise the nice bits. If you don't condemn the awful bits, then you go to hell for your moral perversion. Now, why isn't this just as reasonable a form of divine inscrutability as any other? Or consider what I'm going to call Phil's wager. Let's assume that God is maximally jealous and he reserves the worst punishment in hell for those that have the wrong religion. And everyone else gets to go to heaven. Now, what's the best strategy here? Well, with so many religions, you are unlikely to pick the right one. So the best strategy is to have no religion. Then you won't feel the wrath of God's maximal jealousy. Now, of course, Christians aren't going to accept my wager, but ask yourself why not. Well, they probably think it doesn't fit with God's character, but this just shows that God is only inscrutable when he's needed to be. Now, let me quote one last explanation John gave on his blog. He said, the ultimate good is not human pleasure, nor the ultimate evil, human suffering. The ultimate good is God, and the ultimate evil is blasphemy against God. God's power is more greatly displayed in overcoming evil than in merely avoiding evil. Now, I think we should reject these assertions. After all, how can it be wrong? How can it be worse to insult an indestructible supernatural being than to harm billions of fragile, sentient beings who feel terrible pain and anguish? To think it is moral to choose a display of power over a relief of suffering seems like a very warped sense of morality to me. So to sum up, we have to ask, what is the simplest explanation of the hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering, of the Bible's barbaric treatment of animals? I think that the obvious answer is the God of the Bible is not real, and that these stories are made up by people of a more brutal time than our own. That is a very simple explanation. It fits all of the facts. It doesn't require you to deny science, nor to do contorted mental gymnastics to justify what is pretty obvious cruelty. And that, I think, is a good reason to reject the Christian God. Thank you very much.
To debate such a worthy opponent as Phil and to represent Christianity in the process. The problem of animal suffering touches on one of the most unsettling aspects of Christian thought. How can there exist a good God despite immeasurable pain, suffering, and death in the animal kingdom? The sharpest edge of this question is what's called gratuitous suffering. That is, animal suffering which has no outweighing goods tied to it. We're not talking about the pains of childbirth or bumps and bruises from boisterous play. We're talking about those kinds of suffering with no outweighing good in sight. This is no easy question to answer because Christianity admits tremendous animal pain. The geological record suggests animal suffering in the prehistoric world. The biblical record testifies to animal suffering from the time of Adam and Eve forward, at least. We also have the Great Flood, the entire Old Testament sacrificial system, and all the different harms against war animals and livestock in the Old Testament era. And then there is pain in nature with territorial and predatory animals, death, disease, and injuries. I will try to address some of these poignant issues, but I'll have to save the rest for rebuttals and Q&A. I will be defending the con/negative position. I'm arguing that the problem of animal suffering does not justify rejecting the Christian God. My case will be successful if I demonstrate to fair-minded audience members that the problem of animal suffering is inconclusive, somehow failing to justify rejecting the Christian God. For the problem of animal suffering to be inconclusive, I simply need to establish reasonable doubt. I'm not trying to prove that the Christian God exists, nor am I trying to prove Christianity is true. You, the audience, may have independent evidence for or against God and Christianity as a whole, but this debate is not about that. Nor can I expect to emotionally sway committed atheists or resolve every popular objection against Christianity. We can only touch on a few problems tied to this tricky issue. My task then is both simple and complicated. It's simple because the atheist position carries the stronger burden of proof. I can show it's inconclusive by establishing reasonable doubt, whereas Phil needs to establish reasonable certainty. Now, my case is also complicated in the sense that I'm not just working with generic theism or brute supernaturalism. I'm dealing with the Christian God. If we were talking about deism or open theism, then we could attribute animal suffering to God's indifference or his limited power or knowledge. But my task is complicated because I'm defending classical Christian theism. Fortunately, I don't have to prove that the Christian God exists or that all the Christian lines of argument prove uniquely true. I need only show that Christian theism has the resources to render the problem of animal suffering inconclusive. I will be arguing my case from the position of classical Christian theism, which is the view that mere Christianity is true and God is maximally great. To use St. Anselm's famous line, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. My case for Christian theism is 5 lines of evidence, all safely situated within conventional Christian thought. The moral argument for God's existence, the natural law defense, the imago Dei theodicy, the two false theodicy, and the eternal perfection theodicy. The moral argument and the natural law defense establish a broad framework for the existence of a good God. The 3 theodicies drawn from Christian thought give reasons why that God can be understood as the Christian God. Now, I will not be defending Christianity entire, nor will I be defending related doctrines like the Trinity, the resurrection, and so forth. It would be too ambitious to defend all that in one debate. I will draw some insights from Christian theology, but I'll try to keep the theology pertinent to the problem of animal suffering. In defense of the Christian God broadly, we find Christianity teaching that the morally weighted storylines across all of time and eternity are together infused with the redeeming purposes of a good God. This earthly chapter in our story, however, is pretty harsh, a lot harsher than what our modern sensitivities may have prepared us for. In spite of our social advances and technological breakthroughs, suffering remains a normal, even shocking phenomenon across the biological world. The reality of suffering is so great it should disabuse us of any belief in Buddy Jesus or Santa God or some old man in the sky. In a way, the problem of animal suffering does a great service for Christian apologists. They work like Gideon in the Bible by wrecking all the false idols without even touching the true God. You see, suffering is such a common theme in Christianity, there are whole systems of thought and practice devoted to a theology of suffering. Atheism has almost no orthodoxy. It's a single negation. As long as you abstain from God belief, you're an atheist, no matter whether you oppose animal suffering or support it, whether you're a sociopath or a well-adjusted realist, whether you march with PETA or go hunting on the weekends. In this way, atheism has no leverage to push against apparent evil and suffering in the world. Meanwhile, Christianity goes beyond just explaining suffering and offers a holistic response so we can counteract real-world suffering, reduce animal pain, care for the environment, battle through adversity, and hold fast to redemptive purposes in even the worst suffering. The Christian response to suffering starts with grounded moral facts. Consider the moral argument for God's existence. Animal pain may at first seem like a straightforward argument against God's existence, but we have a hard time making that case unless there are moral facts. And those facts point right back to the truth of God. Here's the argument. Premise 1. Nature alone cannot make moral claims true and thereby factual. Yet, moral facts exist. Therefore, nature isn't all there is. Conversely, a morally sufficient supernatural being exists. Consider the claim, pointless animal suffering should not exist. Is that claim a fact? Yes or no? If it's just a claim about how you feel, what you prefer, or about your own mindless instincts, then it's not a fact about reality, it's just a statement about your private psychology. At best, that would be a statement about public opinion, regardless of what's factually true about the animal kingdom. I'm going to assume Phil is not just talking about his feelings, his private psychology, or just some popular opinion. I'm assuming that he's asserting some sort of moral fact, some truth about the real world. Pointless animal suffering really is evil. It really should not exist. I would agree with him here. We can grant that moral fact. Now we have to ask, what does that fact correspond with? What is its truth maker? We have two options. It can correspond to how nature is or how nature ought to be. The is called a natural fact. The ought is a moral ought. We can't get moral oughts from natural facts, unfortunately, because they are two completely different categories. No amount of is can ever measure up to an ought. Another way to say this is that nature is what it is and knows nothing of what ought to be. If we could describe all the natural facts about reality, all the is statements, this cat is an omnivore, that giraffe is a herbivore, this gorilla is sick and that one is healthy, none of that description would ever rise to the level of prescription, telling us what ought to be and what ought not be. Furthermore, we don't find oughts in physical nature either. You'll never stub your toe on some ought. Einstein, Newton, and Heisenberg never uncovered some ought because oughts aren't physical things or material relations or forces or states. Oughts aren't physical at all. They're hypothetical states. This problem deriving morality from natural facts is called the is-ought problem. This tells us that moral facts must correspond with moral oughts. Now the question becomes, can we get these moral oughts from nature? Not really, because nature is a jerk. Nature can program animals to protect their young or eat their young, to mate for life and have families, or to rape each other and kill all competitors. Even if we acquired moral sentiments in the course of human evolution, every feeling and belief we've ever mustered has been filtered through the mindless, heartless gauntlet of natural selection. According to natural selection, there is no good or evil, no better or worse way to live. There are only survivors and casualties. Nature is red in tooth and claw. Its chief henchman, entropy and evolution, make sure of that. This means if nature is all that exists, then moral facts do not. We can have opinions and feelings, but not facts. I assume Phil is making a case about the real world. He's proposing facts and not just feelings, preferences, or merely private psychology. To make his overall argument work, he needs more than just relativistic statements. Those would be the tactical equivalent of a pillow fight, hardly a threat to the living God. He needs moral facts, and that means God exists. Now we turn to the question of whether that God could have outweighing goods operating in the animal kingdom. My second argument is what's called the natural law defense. Most every case of animal suffering results from natural laws/processes. Those natural laws entail outweighing goods. For example, predictability, consequential behavior, learning, science, etc. So in conclusion, most every case of animal suffering entails outweighing goods. If nature were constructed so that no one could ever feel pain or suffering, the laws of nature would break down. We'd lose at least as many goods as we'd gain, and a great deal of our waking experience would be incoherent and pointless. Likewise, the animal world would miss out on a wide variety of goods. The water cycle gives animals clean water for drinking and bathing, but it also means rainstorms and flooding. Gravity makes animal life possible, but it also means they can fall and hurt themselves. Trophic cascades are another example. In 1995, authorities introduced 14 wolves into Yellowstone National Park. Wolves have a high trophic level, meaning They're high on the food chain. Park authorities were hoping to reduce the population of deer. At first, the wolves caught and ate some of the deer, but more than that, their very presence changed the deer's behavior. The deer retreated from open grazing areas, thus protecting fields and forests. Barren fields and woods turned green again. The soil grew rich, sustaining new foliage. The wolves also killed coyotes, so rabbits, weasels, foxes, badgers, and mice could return. Meanwhile, the trees of the forest, cottonwood, aspen, and willow, exploded in growth. Many shot up 8 times faster than before. As the forest grew, the birds and tree animals returned. Hawks, eagles, and falcons had a new home now and joined with bears and other predators to feed on carrion left by the wolves. Beavers also returned. Those little ecological engineers began building dams which served as a habitat for otters, ducks, reptiles, turtles, and other river animals. As the forest grew, they stabilized the banks, preventing their collapse. Growing fields with their root systems reduced soil erosion, changing the course of rivers. Water pooled in different areas, no longer dribbling straight into the river. Ponds and riffle sections formed, all great for wildlife. The rivers meandered less, reducing soil erosion. There's a wonderful video about this on YouTube called How Wolves Change Rivers. And so we find that even a small amount of predatory behavior can restore plant life, regrow forests, repopulate species, foster new and rich habitats, diversify wildlife, and promote the overall health of the environment. Applied to Christianity, this redemptive use of death and suffering can be expected if a good God is sovereign over a broken world. It is still a good world, but it's fallen. The majestic beauty of nature and biodiversity hint at heaven, yet the brokenness and suffering in nature testify of paradise lost. Speaking of paradise lost, let's turn to the doctrine of the Imago Dei, meaning the image of God. Before the sin in the Garden of Eden, we find mention of the Imago Dei in Genesis 1:26 through 28. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And God blessed them. "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Applying this image of God as an argument, we find it is a great good that mankind is made in God's image to reflect his authority on earth in stewardship, cultivation, responsibility, etc. Exercising the Imago Dei entails real consequences, ruling over a free and rebellious creation. Therefore, exercising that great good entails real consequences on earth. A lot of animal suffering rests on human shoulders. We have the privilege and responsibility to make the world a better or worse place. We can reap the rewards or suffer the consequences. And because we have great authority on earth, innocent animals can suffer the fallout when we don't take our role seriously. If you're familiar with the Genesis story, you know that's exactly what happens. And so we have our next response to the problem of animal suffering, the two falls theodicy. Excuse me. When Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden, they set a destructive course for the rest of human history. We call this the Adamic fall. Scripture, however, reports not one fall, but two, the Adamic and the angelic fall. And you'll notice Genesis 3, Isaiah 14, these are Old Testament references here, testifying to angelic falls, and other references here. Here I'm talking about the punishments for sin doled out to humanity and to fallen angels, as explained in Scripture. While the Adamic fall helps explain the effects of sin after the garden, including natural and moral evil, the angelic fall helps account for the effects of sin before and after the Garden of Eden. Christians need not be surprised by natural evil in the archaic world, such as predatory behavior, animal suffering, extinction events, and so on. Satan is described as the god of this world, the prince of the power of the air, who seeks to steal and kill and destroy. At least since Satan fell from grace, biblical Christians can predict brokenness and animal suffering in the natural world, even though God still preserves good and beautiful order in the world despite animal suffering. Spiritually speaking, the earth is a war-torn landscape, and the war isn't over. From a Christian perspective, explaining natural evil without mentioning Satan is like trying to explain World War II without mentioning Hitler. Last, let's turn to the final chapter of the book, heaven. This is the eternal perfection theodicy as developed by Clay Jones. We cannot judge God's purposes at work in the story of life on earth if we leave out the final chapter. Our book review is premature when we've only read the first half of the book. If we cannot explain natural evil without mentioning Satan, we certainly can't hope to explain God's plans if we leave out the biggest one. Christianity teaches that God's overarching redemptive purpose across human history is to save us from our sins, not just for now, but for eternity. And he's not just bringing us to heaven as guests, but as nobility. He aims for more than just reducing pain and increasing pleasure, or reducing evil and promoting good. That's what babysitters are for. That's fine, but our Heavenly Father has bigger ambitions than just that. God is raising a people group who are fit to rule and reign with him in Genesis 1 and Revelation 22. In the first and last chapters of our story, God has appointed mankind for positions of authority in paradise. But how can saved people go to heaven, retain their free will, and even rule and reign with God forever, yet never use their heavenly freedom for evil? If we are never going to misuse our free will in heaven, we need to learn fully and finally that sin is a really big deal, and it is stupid. It is just not worth it. What on earth could possibly teach us such an important lesson so that we remember it forever? Perhaps the whole history of life on earth, all suffering included, is a permanent lesson on the utter stupidity of sinning. The school of hard knocks is an effective education like that. To sum things up, the problem of animal suffering only works if gratuitous animal suffering exists. However, we have seen in the reality of moral facts and the moral argument that a good God exists. We have also seen several of his redemptive purposes: biodiversity in an orderly world and natural laws via the natural law defense. There's also shared authority and meaningful responsibility seen in the Imago Dei defense. There's also angelic and human free will in the Two Falls theodicy. And to cap it all off, there is eternity in heaven, restoration, and salvation in the eternal perfection theodicy. So what's the ruling? The problem of animal suffering is inconclusive. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, John, for that fascinating presentation. It's nice to see that we agree that animal suffering is a big headache for Christianity, but I don't think it's cured by John's response. Now, of course, I would say that, wouldn't I? But let's try and demonstrate why. Firstly, John asked about whether animal suffering is a moral fact. Now, some philosophers describe moral statements as opinions and others as facts. But it makes no difference to this argument as long as you agree that unnecessary suffering of sentient beings is somehow wrong, which I think Christians generally affirm. Now, John, I believe, thinks that sex before marriage or homosexual sex is wrong, perhaps objectively wrong. No, I don't. So if we were to debate that, we would need to discuss competing moral theories. But in this case, we both agree that needless animal suffering is wrong, so such discussions are irrelevant. The only thing we need to do is decide if the biblical God allows or causes this sort of unnecessary suffering. And the evidence is, yes, he does both. Now, John claims that moral facts point to the existence of God, but he didn't give us a justification of how, only a denial that natural facts do it. As far as I can see, positing God as the source of morality is just divine subjectivism. How do we know that moral facts exist? Well, maybe you might say, my intuition tells me they exist. But if I can trust my moral intuition, then I can conclude that God's brutal treatment of animals is wrong. If I can't, then I have no basis to affirm that moral facts exist. Moreover, where do moral intuitions come from? If they come from a God, then why do they tell me the biblical God is a moral monster? And if there are moral facts, surely genocide, including the killing of all these animals, is chief amongst them. If that isn't a moral fact, then I don't know what is. Now, another problem with the moral argument was noted by Christian philosopher Richard Swinburne. He says that if there are moral facts, then they must be true in all possible worlds. It's not like in some possible worlds, rape is wrong, and in others it's right. So they are not contingent. They must be necessary truths if they are objective. But if they are necessary truths, then they aren't contingent on God either. So either moral statements are not objective, or if they are, they don't come from God. Either way, the moral argument fails. Now, John claims that you can't bridge the is-ought gap by appealing to natural facts. But if you've experienced suffering, you know it's intrinsically bad, and perhaps that could be a way to ground morals on natural facts. I don't see how appealing to supernatural facts helps one bit. And if oughts come from minds, and minds are the natural products of brains, then you can get an ought from nature. Once natural selection makes minds, it means that reality is no longer mindless. Now, John's argument ignores a crucial scientific lesson of emergence, which is where new properties arise that did not exist in the component parts, but only exist in certain configurations of those component parts. Think of the wetness of water. Water is just 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. And at a certain temperature, it's wet. Now, none of the individual particles themselves are wet. Wetness emerges given certain conditions. Now, John, in another debate, quoted Richard Dawkins, who said, "The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference." Now, I think what John wants is to imply that this statement means there's no good without God. But this actually doesn't follow. Note the phrase is, at bottom, no good or evil. But it's also true to say, at bottom, there's no wetness of water. That doesn't mean that there is no wetness in the universe. It just means that it's not a fundamental fact. We don't need supernatural intervention to get it. And it may be that minds and morals might be similarly emergent, and hence again, we don't need a supernatural cause. And even if we do, it doesn't follow that the Christian God is that supernatural cause. Now, the next argument is that God needs to operate through regular laws. But God does miracles, doesn't he? When he drowned almost every living thing on earth, or when he killed the Egyptian firstborn, he was intervening with natural laws. So given he's got these cruel interventions, why couldn't he make some miracles to benefit animals? Perhaps he could make it so that we all get our calories through absorbing energy from the sun rather than killing other sentient beings. Now that might take just one miracle. It wouldn't upset the whole natural order. And if God loves regularity so much, why so many mass extinctions? Now, John's description of the benefits of suffering seems to assume an entirely natural order, an odd assumption for a theist. A supernatural God can make a water cycle that doesn't lead to floods, or a world where the wolf and lamb lie together. Isn't that what it's supposed to look like after Christ returns? And are there natural laws in heaven, and therefore pain and suffering there too? Or, or maybe natural laws not so necessary? Next, John claims, and the quote is, "And because we have great authority on earth, innocent animals can suffer the fallout when we don't take our role seriously." But this seems totally unjust. Why should God allow animals to suffer for our mistakes? John also said, a lot of animal suffering rests on human shoulders. Well, animals have been suffering before humans existed. So I'm not sure this response shows an understanding of the problem. Now, it's true that some suffering is at our hands, and that's mainly because humans like to eat meat. But humans don't really choose to like meat. It's a biological drive that's there because meat is rich in protein. But God could have made it so that we don't like meat. That would save billions of animals from the suffering at our hands. But instead, he told us to eat animals, and kill a few extra ones as a sacrifice for him too. Now, John talks of the fall of Satan, apparently mentioned in Genesis 3. But in fact, the tempter of Adam and Eve is only described as a serpent. And that's weird, because Satan is named in the book of Job. So why isn't he named in the book of Genesis? Why isn't this fall event in Genesis if it happened before humans ever existed? The answer should be obvious. The idea of Satan as a sort of anti-God hadn't been made up yet. That perfectly explains why in Judaism, Satan is simply seen as an angel that has to act with God's permission, unlike in the Christian description. That's strong evidence of an evolving mythology, not a true story. But let's suppose this pre-Adamic fall did happen. Why does this mean that Animals have to suffer from predation or asteroid impacts. Can't an omnipotent God protect them? Moreover, a rebellion in heaven is not what you would expect if it's this perfect paradise. I mean, maybe the rebellion happened because God was so cruel to animals. And if it was so long ago, why hasn't God won the war yet? He's supposed to be all-powerful, and after hundreds of millions of years, still no victory. And let's consider the eternal perfection theodicy. John says, but how can saved people go to heaven, retain their free will, and even rule and reign with God forever, yet never use their heavenly freedom for evil? But why do we need to rule in heaven? And does God use his free will for evil? If yes, then he isn't perfectly good. If no, then it is possible to have a being that doesn't use free will for evil. And God, being all-powerful, could make other beings that have the wisdom not to use their free will for evil. And why should we think that free will is this infinite good that can allow any kind of suffering? I mean, if you really thought free will was this infinite good, then why not just release every criminal from jail? After all, those jails are interfering with their freedom. But God has lots of commandments to worship him and punishments of hell if you don't. But he seems to lack commandments to protect basic freedoms. Where's the commandment, thou shalt not infringe freedom of religion? Okay? But the thing is, this shows us that God doesn't really supremely value human free will. And it's just irrelevant to the issue at hand. Animals were suffering before humans existed. And so this isn't about issues of human development. It's about why God allows so much natural suffering and about why God commands so much cruelty to animals in the Bible. Positing an afterlife that, conveniently, we can't check actually exists, doesn't explain any of that. So to sum up, John has not provided us with reasonable doubts, only unreasonable ones. The suffering of animals gives us reasonable doubt as to the existence of God. The moral argument doesn't work and is irrelevant to this question. The natural law argument doesn't work because God does miracles. And the image of God and eternal perfection arguments are irrelevant because animals suffered before humans existed. The two fools argument just looks like a piece of mythology and certainly would not explain the cruelty that God carries out in the Bible. Moreover, it contradicts the natural law argument. Is Satan responsible for the natural law? Now, just imagine, I know this might be hard if you believe in God, but just imagine that there is no God. And the Bible was invented by people of a time when cruelty to animals was more acceptable. What would we expect to find if that were true? Well, perhaps cruelty to animals by God in the Bible. And that's exactly what we do find. It would also explain the horrendous suffering we see in nature. It's a very parsimonious explanation, and it implies that the Christian God, as well as any other similar sort of omnipotent God, omnibenevolent God, does not exist. Thank you very much.
Phil made far more unsupported claims than I can realistically address in the rebuttal period. This is called, in formal debate settings, steamrolling fallacy, when you just throw out 100 different lines of objection, many of which are claims, which in the 10 minutes I've got, I cannot realistically be expected to respond to them. But nonetheless, he tried to stay within Christian theology, so I'll just chalk it up to some incidental accident. Now, he also demonstrated that atheists, at least in this case, can be very bad at theology and bad at biblical exegesis. If Phil were God, then he would do things differently. I gather that. What he hasn't shown is that if he also had the knowledge of God and not just the power of God, he would still do things differently. That's the kind of thing that needs to be shown. He mentioned, for example, redundancy. According to the biblical record, there were at least 3 test periods where you had Adam and Eve and Satan, and then with the whole fall of the other angels besides Satan, there are many other test cases that are inferred in Scripture. Also, he said the Old Testament is silent about mentioning the satanic fall that could have been pre-Adam. He didn't. That was an unsupported claim. It was a bald claim. I welcome him to prove it rather than me assume defending assumed the burden of proof for defending a claim that he made without evidence. Steamrolling without clarifying his argument, oftentimes in the form of open question fallacy. This is where you make an open-ended question, which is a clever way that reporters often use to get a claim in there without absorbing a burden of proof for a claim, which is a rational way to go about things. I say this, and here's my reasons for it. When you ask an open question, you can infer a claim without it actually being a declaration, and so you're not claiming anything, and it's a sneaky trick. So we had a lot of open question fallacies, but remember, I'm appealing to fair-minded audience members, and I'm asking those of you that recognize an open question fallacy that you don't necessarily answer the question the way he's implying, but question the very questions. Be a skeptical audience. He mentioned, for example, astrosociology. That I'm not sure why I should consider theologically that to be a live candidate to be considered on par with other things. I've never run across any formal theologian or text that considers that a live option. So again, that's a claim that I'd like to see the support for it. He doesn't seem to take the natural law theodicy seriously. The response he gave seemed somewhat dismissive and not overall effective in showing that a good, orderly, interactive, interrelated, interwoven world that still has great moral responsibility and still has great moral consequence, where we can be part of great blessings and great suffering. We can make twin towers, or we can fell them to the ground. That's the tremendous and awesome power that we human beings have, and that comes with consequence. Now, in review, Phil needs to establish that the problem of animal suffering justifies rejecting the Christian God, not simply abstaining, equivocating, or delaying on the matter. Popularly defined atheism, as lack of God belief, for example, would be sufficient for my case. Lacking God belief is an abstention, not a rejection of Christian theism. Likewise, agnosticism, deism, and non-Christian theism could also work, so long as the problem of animal suffering does not justify the knowledge claim that the Christian God is false or unworthy of belief. The only position that would contradict my case would be the rejection of Christian theism. I only need to establish reasonable doubt. I'm not trying to prove Christianity true, but only show the problem of animal suffering inconclusive. And that brings us to the inscrutability defense, which he mentioned in his argument, but I didn't really recognize what he was describing compared to the literature. The inscrutability defense can be explained as we're asking, why does a given instance of animal suffering exist? Why does a given instance of animal suffering exist? Well, perhaps it's not there. That seems to be Phil's conclusion. But a thoroughgoing inscrutability defense says that perhaps there are no seums. That is, my slides are out of order. Okay, here we go. Perhaps it's not there. There's no outweighing good there. Perhaps we aren't really looking. This is what Phil needs to establish, that he's really looking. Perhaps we're not looking in the right place. Again, Phil would need to establish that we're really looking and we're looking in the right place, and that our eyes aren't closed, and that it's sometimes it could be right in front of us, but we don't want to see it. And this brings us now to the last way that we might not see a potential purpose involved. Perhaps we're honestly looking, but it's still invisible to us. Stephen Weikstra, who's the chief formulator of the inscrutability defense, refers to no-see-ums. No-see-ums are like this. They're like smaller than mosquitoes, and they are bites, or they're biters. And you won't even see them because they're so small. So the question is, can suffering occur that has causes that we can't see? And we know just from natural experience, yes, there can be suffering that has causes which we can't see. And so Stephen Weikstra used this as an illustration for why people need to demonstrate, if they're going to make the case that we should be able to see these reasons, they need to show why should I grant that we should be able to see these reasons, because none of us in here are omniscient, but we're talking about an omniscient God. That's the character elaborated in the problem of animal suffering. He called this conditions of reasonable epistemic access. So inscrutability then becomes, we have reasons to expect that we cannot understand some of God's reasons. It is not an argument from ignorance. That's a common misconception. It's not saying we don't know, therefore God must have reasons we don't know. It's saying the God that is at focus in the problem of animal suffering is precisely the kind of being who would operate in ways that reflect his omniscience. And namely, since we're not omniscient, we can't reasonably expect to understand all his purposes. Now, he mentioned tar pits. How am I doing on time?
You've got 4 minutes exactly.
Okay. For the tar pits to illustrate meaninglessness or gratuitous suffering, Phil needs to show not just that suffering happened, but that they lack any outweighing good. It tells us virtually nothing to say, I see no reason there, because he hasn't shown that he looked very hard. Meanwhile, we have an array of theodicies and defenses on stock, even if God may have other reasons we don't know about. Character building, consequential worlds enable learning, discovery, and character building relative to the mental capacity of animals. We're not talking about human levels, but relative to the capacity of animals. Free will and punishment, see the two false theodicy. I mentioned this already. Imago Dei, the tar pits and surrounding environments are part of the wild creation which we have the privilege and responsibility to cultivate and care for. Natural law defense. It's good to have a chemical recycling dump which doesn't require miraculous intervention. Natural law is often discernible, consequential, and orderly outcomes whereby life and activity are possible and knowledge can be reliable. If God were constantly intervening to prevent all suffering, that would be intrusive and would sacrifice many other goods. For example, science, paleontology, geology, archaeology, chemical engineering, and technology all draw great benefit from the tar pits. Recycling of organic matter times destructive distillation equals hydrocarbons and free carbons. And we can mention it's a habitat for certain, for 200 to 300 kinds of bacteria. We get pitch, other sealants and water repellents, moisturizers, lubricants, asphalt, resin, polymers, and plastics, fuel, medicines, wood stain and varnish, and even dandruff shampoo. All from tar pits. The Great Flood. God has a different and higher moral authority than we do. Now, I'm not using this lightly, but we are talking about a creator God. We're not talking about you and me. We have examples of different moral authority between a parent and a child. Parents are allowed to do things that the children are not yet. Soldier versus civilian. King versus citizen. A judge versus the rest of the court. God gave life and its his to reclaim. God is the author of creation and he can rewrite it. No, we can still make moral judgments about God, but we need to recalibrate our measurements to account for God's unique status. And I don't think Phil even showed that he tried to do such. Eternal perfection theodicy. The flood is what our sin looks like. It's a lesson on why we should hate sin. But if we excuse sin and hate the judge, we've inverted the lesson and missed the point. I don't think he quite took the eternal perfection theodicy seriously. And in that way, I think illustrated theology is a craft. It takes some patience and humility to do it well. I'm not assuming theologians will all reach same conclusions as me, but we have to do it with some humility. Also, inscrutability. God's omniscience enables long-term decisions that would mystify people who can't foresee those things. The Imago Dei. Biblically, it's our fault. Just as a drunk, abusive parent hurts the whole family, humanity, drunk with power, was a blight to the whole earth. You see this in Genesis 6, 1 through 7. God doesn't enjoy punishing wicked people. As I live, declares the Lord God, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live. Now, Phil mentioned about a dozen other different objections. How am I doing on time?
30 seconds.
Okay. I'll mention just one or two things regarding the Canaanite conquest, the Amalekites. The Canaanites could rightly be destroyed in the same way ISIS could. When people say, how could God kill all these innocent people? Destroying this whole civilization? Because he's not doing it just for the immediate results. He's doing it for the long-term consequences to make sure that culture cannot come back. What happens if you adopt a child who was raised by Amalekites to think bestiality is okay, incest and molestation and domestic abuse is okay? What happens when they grow up and find out that their adopted parents killed their birth parents?
So, just, again, I don't know if I went over it, but I'll just go over it again. We're having 2 questions from each side. We're not going to do any more than 15 minutes per question. And I'm just going to step back and just let them go at it, okay? But the first question from Phil to John is, John, you presented a number of explanations for animal suffering in your opening statement, including the needed regularities of the world, creating humans in the image of God, the two falls, and perfecting humans for heaven. But how can any of these explain the suffering that God causes or commands, such as the Great Flood, the 10 plagues, or the Canaanite massacres?
Okay, so there's a lot there. Basically, key events in the Old Testament, how could that be justified? One of the key concepts that I don't know that I covered well enough in my opening statement was the difference between corporate justice and individual justice. Now, corporate justice is, it refers to a collective, a group identity. So I say, when the king stumbles, the kingdom falls. Now, is that just for the individuals within that kingdom? Well, yes and no. It depends on what you mean by justice. Is it just for us to receive benefits when the king does really good? Someone who's in charge, who has representative authority status. There could be shared blessings. But the converse of it, compared to individual justice, which is our normal default in a very individualistic, customarily Western mindset, is we only received our earned benefits. We don't receive benefits from others unless we've got an elaborate view of entitlements that doesn't really flow from an individual justice model, but a corporate justice model. Shared curses and punishments, of course, I don't want to suffer from someone else's mistakes, but if I want to receive benefits from other people's successes, then that's kind of, that comes with the territory. Now I'll put all these up here. I don't need to go through each of them individually. Now, Scripture affirms both senses. From a biblical Christian worldview, we see visiting the iniquity of the father on the children. That's a corporate justice concept. So, for example, if a person has a drinking problem, an alcoholic, now, is it just for the children individually to suffer punishment for it? Well, not individually. Is it a normal consequence? Is it just for us to have the privilege, the opportunity to be able to influence people? Well, yeah, there's free will, and real consequences empower great free will. An example that Clay Jones uses is, imagine if God intervened to prevent all negative consequences, including, for example, fire starting. If firemen knew that there was never going to be a fire that broke out in a building that collapsed on people, and it would just keep burning and never collapse on people, how good do you think those firemen would be at their job? How seriously would they race there? There has to be real consequences. Now, this is in part in the Imago Dei theodicy to refer to our representative authority. We are princes and princesses over creation. We're subregents of God's authority. But it's also a natural law theodicy indirectly. So that's a concept I'm going to come back to. That helps make sense of the responses I'm going to put up here right now. You asked a big question regarding the Great Flood, the 10 plagues, and the Canaanite massacres. Corporate guilt is at work here, I think, in the Great Flood. Human evil and potentially demonic evil were predicating factors. That's the biblical record. Genesis 6 says that. So as a biblical Christian, that's a normal teaching of the church. Hence, free will, the Imago Dei, and two-fall theodicies were operational. So my theodicies are still there. Now, you may not like them, you may dismiss them, but I'm not trying to prove them true. I'm only trying to establish reasonable doubt. It would take too much to establish Christianity is true and all this other stuff. Then the 10 plagues, again, corporate guilt. Egypt was guilty of slavery, racism, and rampant oppression. The evil was deep and institutional, hence a corporate punishment was justified. The people deserved economic fallout, for example, dead cows. Now, and the next one, a military defeat, which was dead horses. Now, animals were used instrumentally, and they were used for punishment instrumentally. If the Egyptians hadn't been starting wars of aggression or enslaving people, perhaps those animals would have been well cared for and would have had a better life. But that's how corporate responsibility works. So that's the prepared material I've got.
Okay, can I respond?
Yeah.
Okay, so this whole idea of corporate responsibility is something that I think most people don't think it's just anymore. Like, yes, certainly in the Bible it says, I will visit the sins of the father onto the children. But, we don't think we should be punishing German children today for what the Nazis did. It's just not just. And if you go to the Canaanite massacres or the 10 plagues, you say, okay, Egypt did all these bad things, but the animals didn't do bad things. Why are they being punished? That doesn't seem to make any sense to me at all.
I'll speak to the animals in a second. So do you deny the legitimacy of, say, reparations?
Well, no, I don't think there's anything wrong with reparations.
Okay, so you don't think, you're not denying corporate responsibility.
But that's not what I would call corporate responsibility.
That is what I would call it.
Okay, but what we're talking about here is whether it's okay to punish someone else for the crimes of others.
On an individual basis.
And that's what I'm saying is not just.
Now,
and if you think it is just, do you think it's okay to punish the children of Germany today for what the Nazis did in the 1940s?
The interplay between these is basically one of the long history of ethics issues. How do we deal with that? Australia is having the same problem with the Aborigines. How do we address past injustices against these people? Well, is there only individual guilt? Well, if there's only individual guilt, then none of these individuals alive today were the ones who settled Australia back then. None of the individual white people or Europeans are the ones who today are the ones who enslaved people back when it was legal. So if it's only individual guilt, then there's no corporate responsibility. Now, we might need better terms to clarify them. You use the word punishment. That's kind of a normal default term, but maybe we need something more broad like consequences or outworkings or social justice to talk about a distributional model where we can take from a corporate guilt and not individually destroying every individual, but it's still acknowledged. For example, Germany still has laws on the books that are consequences from World War I and World War II.
Can you answer the question? Is it just to punish German children for the crimes of their grandparents?
If by punish you mean individual justice, no. If by punish you mean respects the laws that were punishment as for war crimes in World War II, yes.
So you think it's okay to punish the children for the war crimes of their grandparents?
So for example, gosh, my history's so weak. I think it's currently going on now. And
I'm not asking you if it's going on, I'm asking you, is it just to do so?
And I asked a counter-argument, reparations.
Yes.
Are reparations in principle justified more than a generation past an event?
They may be.
So, then
okay, but let me explain why that's not applicable.
I don't think individuals should be punished for a corporate offense.
Okay, that's I think all we need to establish what we need for this argument.
But the corporate still has to suffer.
The reparations,
so for example, government or representative body. Yeah.
Okay, the reparations issue is an interesting one. How do we, reparations for the Aboriginals who may have been harmed in the past?
Yeah.
Same with African Americans here in America today. They were brought over as slaves. Yeah. Could there be compensation? But these are very interesting, deep issues, but they're irrelevant to this case because
they're the example.
But they're not relevant. The reason that they're not relevant is because God is killing these animals not for any. He's not creating reparations for anybody else. They're being killed, and it even says in the Bible why they're being killed, to show off God's power. So this reparations argument is just irrelevant.
So you granted the example that demonstrates that corporate guilt does make some kind of sense, even though it doesn't apply the same
Not as a punishment.
I get a second point to get to your animal issue. We'll agree to disagree on the punishment thing.
Okay.
Regarding animals, let's see. Do I have something on this? Regarding animals, we have, let's take the Amalekites, for example. Okay. You may not be aware, but in Leviticus 18 and 20, and I think it appears also in Deuteronomy, there's a list of laws saying, as the Canaanites do, don't do this. And then it goes through a whole list of incest relations, molestation, child sacrifice to Molech, and bestiality. Many people don't realize that there were Hittite laws that said it's not okay. They banned certain kinds of bestiality, but were silent and permissive on other kinds of bestiality. So, for example, pigs. You were not allowed to have sex with pigs according to Hittite law. But horses were okay. Cows were okay. Now, what happens when you sexualize an animal so that they come to identify the touch of a human as a sexual approach? Well, that means that anytime your child gets near to the cow or the horse, you have a disturbed animal. You have a danger to the family. And so that's one of the aspects of why the Amalekites did not get to keep their animals. Number two, the slaughter was, according to Scripture, they were primarily charged to drive them out. Now we look at the strong language. There's some disagreement among theologians about whether they were totally wiped out or whether they were driven out, and many were able to survive. But they were supposed to be driven out in several different verses. So any animals that were driven out were allowed to go. Third, we have war profiteering. If they're able to keep the animals, that's plunder, that's pillage. And plundering and pillage is the incentive to do more warfare. Curbing warfare is a principal good thing, even if you have to make sacrifices in some of those.
Okay, so basically the sexuality thing, basically it seems to be implying that you should kill a rape victim because, they've been, molested and they might be disturbed. So kill the victim?
Should you kill a rabid dog?
A rabid, if it's a danger to other people,
then we're agreed.
Then no, because the command.
I'm not talking about rape victims.
First off, the command is kill all of their animals. Okay.
Yes, and multiply that by the passages about
you're basically claiming some of them might have been some of the Hittites or the Canaanites. There's no evidence, as far as I can see, that this did happen. But even if it did happen, right? Even if it did happen, I've read Clay Jones. Who is it correct that you got this from Clay Jones?
From several sources.
Okay, fine. Okay, Clay Jones, who you've quoted it here, so he basically gave the evidence as a line in a Hittite poem, which is a fertility god saying, they had. The fertility god had sex with the cows because it's a fertility god. It's a poem. Of course, lots of warring factions, they put out propaganda against their other side. Let's not forget that, the Hebrews were doing sacrifices to animals. They were killing them, right? And personally, I think I'd sooner. Sorry.
Sacrificing two animals or sacrificing animals?
Killing animals as a sacrifice to God. Okay, so there could be equally justified saying, look at the Hebrews, they're killing their animals, for no particular good reason. And so I think, I think we have very good reason to doubt there was any of this sexualizing of animals going on. But even if it did happen, and it might have, but I don't think we should believe it because
I'm not going to overstate the historical claim beyond what my memory can back up.
Okay.
But you referenced the passage about Baal.
Yeah.
And Baal was a cow god.
Yes. He's a fertility god.
Fertility god. He was a common object of veneration in the ancient Near Eastern world: Hittites, Amalekites, Amorites, so on. And are you familiar with religious phallic symbols?
Yes.
What they would do is these phallic symbols were shaped roughly like the male member, and women would use them to stimulate sexual arousal, and it was supposed to be within a religious rite to worship God. So you can imagine how they went much further than bagels and coffee to try to draw audiences to their religious services. They had temple prostitution. They had this was fairly well acknowledged. At least several different scholars I ran across, but I apologize.
But what's that got to do with killing animals? So I don't see what the justification is.
I was giving the background for why we should understand the description of Baal, who his sister is supposedly, his sister supposedly took on the form of a calf, and he raped the calf 80 times 8 and 70 times 7. And this is considered like a worship music song. Now it's
a fertility poem. What does that have to do with killing all of the animals? I mean, people do have sex with animals. I don't see any evidence that means that those animals are suddenly dangerous to people, that they're rabid dogs. There's no evidence for that.
I would ask you to consider animals that have been physically abused.
Right, so we should just kill them.
If
kill
they're
the
a danger
victim?
to humans, yes.
But where's the evidence that they are a dangerous animal? I mean, look at the context.
I don't know.
Look at
any
the
raped
context.
animals
It's a
lately,
war.
so
It's
if we find some. then,
okay.
yeah.
Look at the context. It's a warfare command. Kill all of the living things in your
And
enemy's
most
territory.
of them were driven out beforehand.
Right.
And
But
we
the
know-
command
and we
is to
know
kill
that
them
over
all.
400 years of the opportunity to
One second.
repent, they failed to do so, and they had thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of Jewish lives and other Canaanite lives were killed later because they failed to wipe them out.
Okay.
The culture resurrected, essentially.
Right.
That was good. All right, second question for you, John. Christian philosopher William Lane Craig thinks that animals' lack of a prefrontal cortex has shielded the animal kingdom from experiencing pain and suffering, and that this is evidence of the goodness and ingenuity of God. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we both agree that Craig is just wrong and is misrepresenting the science. But there seems to be no logical contradiction to suggest that this couldn't have been done. Yet it hasn't been done. So why isn't this evidence against God's perfect power and goodness?
To say it hasn't been done is false. So the proper qualification would be it hasn't been done for all animals. It has been done for many animals. Many animals with a prefrontal cortex have other mitigating features that help reduce and restrict suffering. For example, pain aversion behavior, tonic immobility. This is really fascinating something. You can go look it up on YouTube. Animals that can be coaxed into a sleep a trance response, and you can kind of and they apparently don't have any feeling at that point. This is the kind of thing that if we have a broken world that is lorded over by someone whose chief goal is to steal, kill, and destroy, and beyond them is a God who's still allowing free will and a great history-long lesson for those that will be ruling and reigning under his authority in heaven, we would expect there to be curbs and restrictions so that the destruction isn't total, but there's different qualifying factors in there. If higher order animals couldn't feel pain, they'd miss a lot of critical information for survival. They'd be handicapped if they didn't have the response system that pain is. Plus, there's a burden of proof. Phil claims it's evidence against God's perfection, so the burden is on him to prove his claim, not on me to refute it. And then there are trade-offs. That move would sacrifice at least as many goods as would be gained. Now, he mentioned Bill Craig. I don't ascribe to, you granted this, I don't ascribe to neo-Cartesianism. And when you talked about the prefrontal cortex, I still maintain my point, and I don't think you represented it correctly because I said they're largely differentiated by their prefrontal cortex. Most of the animal kingdom doesn't have a prefrontal cortex in the same way we do, and they don't have the executive function that we do. We don't know of any animals that do Sudoku on the subway to work. The executive function of our prefrontal cortex, its ability, its functionality, distinguishes humans from the rest of the animal kingdom. I wasn't making simply a statement about size. Size does matter, but not all the time.
Okay, so first off, you're saying it's this tonic sleep behavior. I mean, I'm not familiar with this, and maybe it's what you're talking about, with sharks, so you can touch their top of their net, and it's momentary, and it's not part of their existence predominantly. We see enormous amounts of evidence. Maybe I'd like to explain one of the slides I had, that I briefly put up, and the idea was you'd see it, and I can explain it later. Let me give you evidence for that fish feel pain. Okay, the evidence is this: we do an experiment where we give fish time to explore their tank, and they find that there's preferred areas. There might be gravel, certain lighting conditions, so they always go to these preferred areas. Then what happens is, if you give them some sort of painful stimulus, they switch their preference to the area where they generally don't prefer, but you've put an analgesic there. Okay, so that's very strong evidence that fish feel pain, and this is throughout the animal kingdom. We see this. You're right that humans do have bigger prefrontal cortexes, and we can do Sudoku on the way to work. But so what? That has nothing to do with the experience of pain.
It has everything to do with the reference you took out of context. So that's what I.
No. But you were establishing in that context. You were establishing that it was about abortion and what grants the right to life. Mm-hmm. Yes. So the fact that we can do Sudoku
Actually,
on the way to work,
maybe.
so what? Why does-
Maybe not, but I'll hear you. I'd have to go check to see if that's what.
That
Is
is
God is God a utilitarian?
that. Well, there was that. No, that was from the.
I'll suspend my objection.
Okay,
I just
okay,
don't remember.
right. But the point is, it's true that humans have an enlarged prefrontal cortex, but it's completely irrelevant to the question of whether animals can suffer.
So if we
That's nothing to do with it.
So you're going back and forth between pain and suffering here, and in the literature, there's a lot of ink spilled over whether there's a distinction between just the experience of pain and then the experience of awareness of pain. That is, do I think I'm in pain, and am I just feeling pain? This awareness of it is what's typically nicknamed as suffering. That's generally how I use the terminology. Phil might not be using it that way. That's not a critical issue. But when it comes to fish pain, I would ask you, do you think that fish should not be able to feel pain?
Unnecessarily. Yeah. I mean, I think.
Same here.
Okay. The point is that God could have created systems in our. I mean, Will Craig thinks this has happened, and there's no logical contradiction to say that we could be reacting to painful stimulus without having the physical sensation of pain. That you could. There's an analogy they give, which is called blindsight, where you basically react to something visually without having a conscious experience of the visual stimulus.
Now, what we
so
actually
there's no
have
reason why. Yeah, there are cases of blindsight. I don't
not
think it's a.
blindsight, the feeling of pain without the feeling of suffering.
Well, to me, then it's not
awareness of
pain.
but it's not pain.
No, but to me, then it's not, what examples do you want to give for
Okay, leprosy patients.
Okay.
Leprosy patients suffer an eroding of their neural pathways to where they're not able to sense pain as such. Now, they can sense feeling. They can feel pressure and such, but it's not a painful stimulus. And what we find is, if you think of leprosy patients, or lepers as they're popularly represented in maybe old biblical stories, we picture them as mangled with fingers and toes missing, broken feet. What happens is because they can't feel pain, they only feel it as touch or as pressure. They don't care. The force of pain doesn't give the alarm that actually changes their behavior.
Right,
and when they reinstituted that with leprosy patients, doctors were able to tamper with the neural pathways enough to where people could have a little external sensor. What they found is people, because they didn't care about the pain, they would get an alarm that said, oh, you're having pain right now. Stop doing that. But it was an alarm. It wasn't a felt sense of pain. They couldn't recopy it. And so what the people did is they just turned it off and went about doing it. And they'd still suffer the same
Right,
infection,
because they can.
same break, same cuts.
Okay. But that's completely different. It's not relevant to this case.
How is it completely
Okay, I'll tell you why. Because God could have given you a system where you have an automatic response, okay, that you don't feel. We have automatic responses, agreed?
We have yeah.
All right? Okay, that you're not consciously aware of. So God could have made the pain response an automatic response,
So
one
no
that you're not
deception.
aware of.
We
Okay,
have no
yes.
deception.
Okay,
Yeah,
right.
That's a real common concept.
Okay. So he could have done that. And that's what Bill Craig thinks did happen. But it didn't happen.
I think
right?
it does happen in most all higher order creatures, and some.
So hang on, you're saying...
Deception is operative.
No, we're not
and
saying...
pain and suffering. And these all have different levels of alarm in their ability to change behavior and give us educational opportunities. So we learn, don't touch that hot stove.
but those educational don't even work, because if you think of the pain systems in
Oh, they work very well. once you touch
No.
hot
Hang
stove.
on. We have many different types of pain. Some of them are effective. They work.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you have acute pain, that's a sort of pain where you touch your hand on a stove and you withdraw it. Okay, that works. That's the functional pain. I accept that. Okay, but there are other types of pain that have no function. So, for example, there's something called neuropathic pain, which is seen in animals, has absolutely no function
You
whatsoever.
said it isn't seen in animals?
It
Or
is seen.
Okay.
It is seen in animals. Has absolutely no function at all, because you don't. It's not. It's a breakdown of the nervous system, of the pain nervous system. So you feel pains, but they're not related to stimuli. Okay. So that has absolutely no function. So if you think God gave, we could also imagine pains that would be useful that we don't have. So for example, you sit out sunbathing and you're getting cancer. It doesn't feel bad. Smoking doesn't feel bad. So there's pains that we have that have no function, and there are pains that would be functional that we don't have. So if you're going to explain pain as saying, oh, God has given it to us because it's so functional, then why all these other non-functional things?
It sounds like you're saying there's a whole lot of different kinds of pain
Yes.
that some seem to serve obvious purposes and others do not seem to serve any obvious purposes. But you haven't yet established that you look seriously to find purposes that, for example...
Well, what would be the purpose of neuropathic pain?
Just explain what neuropathic
It's a
pain
breakdown
is
of the nervous system so that the pain system doesn't function properly and gives you painful stimuli when you don't have tissue damage.
Okay, so I gave theodicies that account for the broad picture of that. Human responsibility and angelic responsibility, a consequential world, those are what I expect. That kind of entropy and the evidence of a fallen world is what I expect. If God is sovereign over a broken world, I expect hints at heaven, but I also expect evidence of brokenness because this isn't it. This isn't heaven. And a lot of the critique against God is that he's too slow in introducing heaven. But biblically, we have reason to understand this world system as giving creative opportunities for us to go reduce animal suffering, go create inventive ways to reduce leprosy equivalents in animals. Go find ways to reduce that. Go find ways to heal and help and bless. I don't find the same kind of incentive from a non-theistic perspective,
so suppose,
except just arbitrary whim.
Suppose Bill Craig was right, okay, that it turned out that animals have been shielded from pain. Okay.
Which I think is true, but I don't go the full way. Yeah.
So are you telling me you would say, no, that's not evidence of God's glory and ingenuity of creation? Is that really what you would say?
Is what not evidence of God's glory?
So suppose it was the case that William Lane Craig was correct, that animals have been shielded from terrible pain and suffering by God's ingenious care of creation. Suppose that was true. Are you telling me that you would say, no, that's not evidence of God's ingenious care of creation?
If it were true, I would agree with him.
Right. So now that undermines your whole point. But you've missed the whole point. The whole point is you're saying that what we see is what I would expect to see. Right? I expect, because of the fall, to see this broken world. But then you're saying, well, if we saw the opposite, that it was, that the animals hadn't been shielded, then I would also think that would be evidence of God. So basically anything is evidence of God, right?
Craig doesn't... you've got a deeper question here about anything as evidence. Let me get that.
I mean, what would you expect to see in terms of animal suffering, given an all-powerful and all-perfect God?
Questions here. Let me see. You mentioned that. There's a lot there. Where to start?
Well, let's start with what would you expect to see, given an all-powerful and all-loving God, in terms of animal pain?
But see,
and derive that from that.
Hypothesis contrary to fact. What if Bill Craig were right about it?
Yeah.
And then what would I expect? If Bill Craig
it's how you would react, not what you would expect. I'm asking you what you would expect, and then how would you react given if that was the case?
I'll have to think about that.
Fair enough.
That's 2 steps abstraction removed, and I want to make sure I fully understand.
Okay, well, maybe I should explain it better. Okay, if God is all-powerful and all-loving, should we really expect all this terrible pain and suffering throughout the animal kingdom? Should we expect that the engine of our creation is this horrible violence? So, for example, if the asteroid hadn't hit the Earth, we probably wouldn't be here.
Is
that really what you would expect to see?
Given the theodicies I gave, yes.
Right. Okay. And
that's one reason. I'm not saying that my theodicies directly contradict Craig. I think he left out, for example, the two falls theodicy. I don't think he appeals to Clay Jones's theodicy, and he might retreat from his position a little bit with a little pressing. So you might have some good opportunity with your paper. He might retreat from that position with a little pressing if he considered these theodicies that I'm bringing to the table, which aren't. I mean, I didn't invent it. The two falls theodicy is implicit within most of Christian history because it's pretty clear in Scripture and it's a theological norm within church history. Now you may not find the two falls theodicy to be all that satisfying as a broad explanation, but it's an example of possible reasons, and you need to show that there's not any possible reasons that a fair-minded audience could grant as possible. And I don't.
But the problem is, possible is so weak a term. Like I could say there's some possible reason why the Holocaust was justified. right? Maybe I don't know the reason. It seems to me completely unjustified.
If you're trying to prove
right?
epistemic certainty, then...
But we
then,
don't
yeah,
need
if you're trying to
certainty.
prove
Certainty is not the
practical
criteria.
certainty, yeah.
The criteria is, what do we do with the evidence that we have? Okay?
Yeah.
We don't need certainty. That's a false criteria.
Why should a Christian expect the world to reflect in no suffering? Is that
Because
fair?
God is all-powerful and all-loving. And that is why we should expect not hundreds of millions of years
Why
of
should
suffering.
a Christian? You just said, why should an atheist expect that if there were a God, he would do that?
I didn't predicate it on atheist or Christian.
Why should a Christian affirming the Bible expect that the Bible is wrong on these accounts and that suffering is not a normal thing with a profound educational value that might possibly actually teach us so that for an eternity we never misuse our free will?
Does it educate the animals?
So that for an eternity we never misuse our free will as authority figures and can actually rule and reign, even with great consequence of our decisions. If we aren't able to have great consequence to our decisions, then we're not getting trained up to rule and reign in a position that'll have great consequence.
Okay, do the animals learn from all this? Do those animals that get trapped in the tar pit, how are they learning?
I answered those already.
Okay.
Yeah. Some animals...
Yeah, okay, so you answered
the
it.
higher order
Okay.
animals can have some
Do
ability.
you guys want to keep going for like 100 minutes?
Okay, you answered
get to my
it.
question.
You answered it
Okay,
with you answered it with the tar pit had all these functional purposes. So yes, we can get all some benefits from tar pits. That was to me completely missing the point. My point that I made in my opening speech was, why don't animals have a sense to avoid the tar pit? They have a sense to avoid fire, right?
You have to assume that they don't.
They don't.
You haven't established that.
Well, we have established that because we have the fossil record. Thousands and thousands of animals die in these tar pits.
But you haven't established that those were... Anyway,
All right,
I want to get to
that's
my
good.
question.
Yeah, that's
All
good
right.
stuff.
Okay.
Good stuff. That was very good. Okay,
I didn't get to one.
Phil,
Yeah,
you mentioned proto-morality for animals.
right.
Would you explain what you mean by this and why people in the audience, including Christians, should consider that relevant to human morality?
Okay, sure. So here's my prepared answer, and we'll get onto it. Right, there are certain pillars of morality like fair play, empathy, punishment for bad behaviour, caring for those in need, that we see in animals. Rats, for example, will rescue fellow rats from cages and will even forego food rewards to do so. This is evidence for empathy and pro-social behaviour. Monkeys, dogs, and birds will accept a reward for a task, but reject the exact same reward if they see a fellow animal get a better reward. That's evidence they have I can show you the video of this if you want to see it later. That's evidence that they have a sense of fairness, and they complain if they see they are being treated unfairly. So actually how they complain is that basically if you get a monkey and you ask it for a task, you give one monkey a grape and the other one a piece of cucumber. If you just give them the cucumber, they'll accept it. And if they see the other monkey getting a grape, what happens is they throw the cucumber back at the experimenter and they start banging on the table, right? That is the Wall Street protest in animals, okay? They're basically saying, that's not fair. Why are you doing this? And dogs do the same thing, okay? There's been similar experiments with dogs and birds. Okay, so what's more is we tend to see moral behavior in animals that exist in social groups. Now, this is not a surprising fact if morality has a natural origin. Maybe it evolved to help group cohesion for social animals. It is a surprising fact, however, if the origins of morality follow the Christian story. In the Christian story, we were created without moral knowledge. And then we ate the forbidden fruit and became like gods, acquiring moral knowledge. Notice that this actually is considered a great crime, perhaps the greatest of all crimes, which incidentally undermines the notion that God gave us our moral compass. A lot of theologians say God imprinted morality onto us, and that's how we know right and wrong. But no, in the Christian story, he didn't give it to us. We took it and we were punished for it. If morality evolved, then that's further evidence that the Christian story is false. And the line of argument you used in your opening statement is deeply flawed. But I want to emphasize that whatever the truth of the moral argument and the origin of morality and all these sorts of issues, it is not a get-out-of-jail-free card for the God of the Bible. In fact, it might make things worse, because it might imply that the torture of animals that we saw, the hoffing the horses, all right, that's not just wrong, it's objectively wrong if you believe that morality is objective. So I think basically there's evidence that morality does have a natural origin, or at least partially, and also, even if we don't understand the origin of morality, it doesn't in any way tell us that God was right to torture all these animals.
So you mentioned moral knowledge coming from the eating of the tree in the garden, Genesis 3.
Yeah.
Why do you think that the scholars on that should think that Adam and Eve did not have moral knowledge before then? I know it says the tree...
Because it says that.
Good and evil.
That's what it says in the Bible. That it's a knowledge of truth, of good and
you're
evil.
Illustrating my point. I don't mean this as an insult, but
Okay.
oftentimes atheists will do elaborate theological claims without doing the task, because theology isn't. There's a craft to it. There's an art to doing it well, and there's ways to do it poorly. And if we say this verse must mean this because it says that, a good theologian would say, well, it says it says these words, but I don't interpret it that way the way you do.
Right.
You need to muster reason for
Okay.
interpretation before fair-minded people should grant that your interpretation.
Okay,
is
so
a good
basically we agree that's what it says, but you don't agree with whether it means that.
that it says what you interpreted. I agree that it says the tree of the knowledge, good and evil.
Right. Okay. So basically, what you're
Knowledge
saying
that
is
good or
what you're
evil,
saying is
not necessarily the knowledge good or evil. In Hebrew, like have you looked at it in the Hebrew?
I have, because
Okay.
I actually studied Hebrew when I was young. As you know, I'm Jewish,
Props for that.
and I was bar mitzvahed,
Yeah.
and yes, that is, my rabbis were agreed that's what it meant. We didn't have moral knowledge, and then we took the moral knowledge from the tree. Okay, so to me, reading the Hebrew doesn't change anything.
Okay.
The point is, what I want to address here, though, is that basically it seems to be you're saying that, oh, if only you were a theologian with a PhD, you would understand what this
I don't mean
passage
it like that.
really meant.
Yeah.
Okay, with
So I'm
or
appealing
without a
before, it's
PhD
just
or whatever.
crap.
All right, okay, fine. But why isn't God then more clear? I mean, why didn't he just make it clear, right? You've got to have all this advanced knowledge to interpret what it is obviously saying. I think the theologians are the ones that are doing the mental gymnastics, not the atheists. We're reading it, and it's got a very obvious meaning.
If you had demonstrated well, anyway, I'll stop pressing it.
Okay.
You mentioned morality evolved for humans from animals. Well, I would ask, I gave examples of how if we're going to do that, it seems selective to say, well, the empathy is the morality, but when monkeys throw their poop at each other, that's not morality. If they are empathetic to each other, that is morality. What's the reference point whereby you can judge that one is moral and the other's not moral, or one's a proto-morality and the other's not? Because if we're going to get anything informative for our behavior from monkeys, then we have to have some principle that's not just an outcome of the arbitrary, mindless drift of evolution, something that reflects moral weight. Where did you, or another way to put this is, how do you add up the facts of nature till you get an ought?
Okay, oughts come from minds. We have a sense of what is bad for us. So we know that suffering is bad for us. We have experience. So we can infer that suffering is bad for others.
And evolution could have made our minds to agree with rape and eating our young and destroying the weak. So why should I trust my mind?
That's going to be your second question. So I don't know if you want to discuss that.
Yeah.
We can come on to that on the second question.
Okay.
The point is, look, there are monkeys that throw poop at each other. Sure, there are humans that do that. Yeah. So what? Right? The point is, we understand that there are certain pillars of morality in human behavior, such as sense of fairness, such as caring for others. And we see this behavior in animals. Okay, that is not surprising if morality was something that evolved, and I don't see how it's not surprising on the Christian story. What happened? Did they eat little bits of the fruit of knowledge? You know, why isn't that mentioned in the Bible?
Regarding the moral argument, I think it would be very surprising to have oughts arise from just is. I don't see in any of that where the is amounts to ought. Now, you did say mind. But you haven't established that minds can come from non-mind. That's a presumption. You mentioned emergent dualism, and that minds.
It's not dualism. It's emergent behavior.
Oh, okay, sorry.
It's not dualism.
Emergent.
It's
mind.
the opposite of dualism.
Okay, so you're saying morality is behavior and not facts?
No. Morality is something that minds do.
Okay.
Yeah.
So morality is a behavior of minds. Okay. So is my mind...
It's an output of minds.
So if
Just as
you have,
mathematics is the output
you have a
of minds.
circularity problem because, think of it this way, my mind is correct according to my mind. Has
Okay.
that told me anything about the real world? That's only told me that my
It
mind
tells you
is
something
programmed to
about.
think that my
It
mind's
tells you
correct
something
morality.
about your experience. You know that suffering is bad in you, right?
No, it does not necessarily tell me anything about the real world. It tells me only about my private
Okay,
psychology.
okay. But would
And
you
nothing
agree?
said has shown
Would
that
you agree
the private
that?
psychology isn't informing us about the real world? Sorry.
Okay. Would you agree that you are able to infer that suffering is bad in you,
Yes,
right?
but I believe in God.
Okay. With or without God, you know that your experience of suffering is a bad thing.
False. It would not be true with or without God. Only with God.
Why?
Because of the moral argument, which I gave earlier.
Well, hang on. But you can't deny that someone who experiences suffering will interpret that as a bad thing. I mean, by definition, that's
okay.
what it is.
If you're saying an atheist can have correct moral knowledge, I grant that.
No, I'm not
atheist
talking
can
about
have
moral
correct
knowledge yet.
knowledge.
We're talking about what we found our view of morality on. So but one of the things that we find it on, okay, and it's a complicated beast. I'm not saying we can simplify morality to all these labels that we use.
Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's a complicated beast, and I think you've put that in your blog, right? But the point is that one of the things we can found it on is our own personal experience of suffering is bad. By definition,
Bad
suffering
for
is
us,
bad.
relatively
yes.
speaking?
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So it's bad. We know that if I get stabbed, it hurts. Right. We know that.
It hurts you, yeah.
It hurts me.
Yeah.
So can I infer that it hurts others?
Yeah.
Right.
That's
Okay. It's a
safe-
reasonable inference.
Yeah. And by
Okay.
hurt, you mean harm, and yeah.
Yeah. But I mean that they don't like it.
Correct.
That's
yeah.
what I mean. So I can infer that. Right?
Relativism
I
is
don't
a pillow
need
fight
a
if you're gonna
God
try to use
to.
it against
I
God.
don't need a God to infer that. With or with, if God exists or not exists, irrelevant to
But
that
I was
question.
assuming
right?
that you're talking about facts about the real world, not
That
facts about
is,
private psychology.
but
They
they're
don't
not
want it to
separate.
happen, but you haven't shown that they should not want it to happen. You haven't gone from an is to an ought.
Okay, they're not separate. If you can say that suffering hurts, okay, that is, yes, it's private psychology. I experience the suffering, but that is a real world. There's a great quote in Harry Potter. Do you remember the scene? I don't know who's seen the last Harry Potter film. There's a brilliant scene where Harry meets Dumbledore, and it's in this sort of fantasy version of King's Cross Station, and he's like, is this happening in my mind, or is it real? And Dumbledore says, of course it's happening in your mind. But why does that mean it's not real?
Okay.
You see the point?
Yeah.
So the fact that it's happening in your mind, you can't say that doesn't tell me anything about the real world. It tells you a lot about the real world.
You're not talking. I think I belabored the distinction between private psychology
Yeah.
versus facts about the rest of the world. You may not want that to happen, and I grant that you don't want it to happen, but why should we not want it to happen? There's a should, there's an ought there, and evolution, if it's a mindless programmer with no design built into it, with no built-in goals, we have a circularity problem. It made our minds to be this way, but we have no great reason to trust that the monkey version of the machinations that made all that was sensible and knew which way was up. We don't have any reason to think that the gauntlet that made everything the way it is should be reliably depended upon to know what good and evil was and to make things that way. Evolution could have made it so that rape is our moral norm. Could it not have?
Okay.
Could have.
Well, okay,
evolution
but
made
I
it so
think
that rape is our
I
moral
think you're
norm?
misunderstanding what we mean when we say morality has an evolutionary origin. What we don't mean, I mean, this is going to be in my second response. So, do you want to go on to that?
Let's just move on.
Yeah, let's go on.
Because we're getting really onto the second question.
So, assuming evolution is true, could human evolution have made us radically different so that, for example, we routinely euthanize all handicapped children, eat our young, castigate homosexuals from society, and rape women as our primary means of procreation?
Okay, so we could ask, could God have made it so that there are people that think there is justification in murdering all the Amalekites, including their men and women, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass? Just look at the Old Testament for justification of repression of gays or justifying rape. Think of the Midianite women. Obviously, in both cases, the answer is yes. So I don't think this decides our question for us. And we don't need to worry about assuming evolution is true. The overwhelming evidence says that it is true. And if it isn't true, then there's a lot more miracles for God to do, which will further undermine your God loves regular laws defense. Now, I want to make it clear that I think that morality has an evolutionary origin, but that is not the same as saying evolution gives us the answers to moral questions, any more than saying evolution gave us the ability to do maths. Yes, it is pronounced maths, not math. But that doesn't mean it's our language, right? You're speaking English. Right, so the ability to do maths doesn't mean it's going to answer whether there's a proof of the Riemann hypothesis. And I think it's likely that evolution gave us neurocircuits like empathy that enable us to care for others. It had to do that because our young take so long to raise. That means we will have to have a tendency to care for our genetic relatives. And in large societies, you don't always know who your genetic relatives are, so that can create a pressure to care for others. This explains why we care so much more about relatives rather than strangers. Why should that be so if morality doesn't have an evolutionary origin? But more importantly, what evolution gave us is advanced brains. And if we look at long-term trends in human behavior, it seems that levels of violence have been steadily declining. And also our circle of empathy seems to be widening. Part of the reason we are having this debate is that our circle of empathy of humans has widened to reach animals. This debate, I think, just wouldn't be happening in biblical times, and not just because our attitudes to animal suffering are becoming kinder, but because, if I questioned God, the moral stance would be stone that blasphemer to death. Now, when Christianity was the dominant ideology of Europe, it was a popular form of entertainment to watch cats being burnt alive. And our advanced brains gave us the ability to learn. And although there's no guarantee that we will, we certainly can learn that living in nasty societies like that which you describe isn't good for our well-being. If you play a game like Monopoly, there are some strategies that are just objectively better than others. You need to buy properties if you are going to win. Now, morality might have some analogy with game theory. We create morality as a sort of winning strategy for playing the game of life. We can use these complex brains that evolution gave us to deduce that we are better off living in a society that doesn't allow these sorts of things. Interestingly, there's been computer tournaments for playing a classic game in game theory called the prisoner's dilemma. Right now, in the prisoner's dilemma, for those of you who don't know it, there are two people separated for a crime. They are asked to rat each other out for a reward of a lesser sentence. But if both prisoners rat each other out, then that's the worst outcome for both. So what should you do? Well, what these computer tournaments do, they play something called the iterative prisoner's dilemma. They have multiple rounds. And what's really interesting is that a strategy that does very well in these tournaments is, you might call it nice tit for tat. So I always start off with a nice move, don't rat the other person out, and then you copy what they do. So nice behavior can be self-organizing. So we don't need God to give us these winning strategies. And the strategies the biblical God gave us seem very far from moral to me.
So that's a lot of information. I think you're still steamrolling.
Okay, I apologize.
Lots and lots of stuff,
okay.
Asking a lot of open
All
questions.
Right. Well, just pick the ones you think are important. That's fine.
So could evolution have made it so that, I have to repeat the question because it sounded like you changed the question and then answered a different question from the start with some very interesting stuff that I think deserves response. Okay. But I think my question deserves response too. Could you repeat the? I
did answer your question. I did say that it is possible. Okay. Yes, of course it is.
Okay, got it.
Right?
Yeah,
of course it is. People did. Look, you think that the massacre of the Amalekites is moral. So evolution, right? So evolution can certainly create beings that have things that I consider immoral.
So evolution could have made it so that the opposite of empathy is the moral norm.
Well, not quite. No, it's not as simple as that because we have to have empathy for our young, our genetic relatives.
Evolution
right? If we, the point is,
must do anything.
No, you're wrong. Because the reason you're wrong is because our young take a very long time to raise. If we don't care for them,
why does evolution care whether our young survive? I don't think evolution cares.
Of course, it's okay. It's not that evolution cares. Yeah. It's that if we didn't care about our young, we would go extinct.
Why would evolution have a preference for humans to survive?
It's not that evolution has a preference. It's that there's a selection pressure for caring behavior in species that are social animals.
Tomorrow we could turn the other direction with a bad weather pattern, according to the way evolution
you can't. Works. You have to care for your young, otherwise you go extinct.
Evolution doesn't require that certain species survive and others not. Evolution could have made us, to use Kim Miller's analogy, could have made us just really resilient individualist mollusks that are super intelligent, but to carry your illustration, but are super individualistic, have no empathy for each other. They're all just rabid competitors. Evolution could have done that instead. Evolution doesn't have to prefer survival value. It just happens to do that.
Yeah, but in mollusks, what you have to know about mollusks is that mollusk lifespan is very, very short. Okay? So they do not spend a lot of time raising their young. But humans do. Okay? And that changes the game. That means that we have to care for our young.
We could get a virus tomorrow that wipes all human beings off of the planet.
Yes.
And because of the mindless drift of evolution, that isn't better or worse. That's just a new thing.
Okay, so better or worse happens. You're right that evolution's value neutral. Evolution is value neutral, but the output of minds is not value neutral. Okay, so once evolution creates minds, then now the neutrality of value is broken. That physicists would say the symmetry is broken. Okay, so now we're not living in a mindless world anymore. Evolution has created minds, and it's minds that give us values.
If our minds were, say, a jury on, a witness on a witness stand, then and all else were equal, we could trust, for example, that our minds bear witness, truthfully, that this is moral, that is immoral. We should care for our young and be empathetic, or we should not. Our minds could be reliable, but evolution is kind of like this big thug who is threatening our minds with survival. We'll kill you if you don't do exactly what we tell you. Now, is that testimony free and reliable and uncoerced? If our minds are forced to do by aimless processes to report exactly what we have, then you've got the circularity problem. My mind is correct according to my mind. That's a circular problem. That's not evidence. That's just saying it's true because I say so.
Well, no, the evidence is that we can see that animals have this proto-morality.
And it could have been totally otherwise, and some of them don't have much of it.
And no, I'm not saying all of them have it. Our argument does not require lots of animals to have it.
Proto-morality will have other behaviors that add a little bit of survival value, but not long-term survival
But
value.
that's irrelevant to this
And
argument.
that short-term survival value might work better in one weather pattern, whereas the long-term would work better in a different weather pattern. And all of that's arbitrary.
Okay, it's not arbitrary, right? Once you create human beings that have minds and other animals that have minds, then they are able to have experiences that they prefer or don't prefer. We are able now to infer, if you like, rules of playing games that are better strategies than other strategies. So you keep talking about the mindless, you keep talking about the mindless nature of evolution. But as we said, once evolution creates minds, reality is no longer mindless.
As soon as minds start adhering to evolution, we have social evolution. Are you supporting social evolution?
What do you mean by supporting social evolution? I don't really understand that question. And I don't understand the relevance of the question is.
Because you introduced minds as socially capable beings and said that somehow signals a transition from mindless evolution to some other stage developments kind of evolution.
Well, what I'm saying is the reality of the world is no longer mindless. So when you say social evolution, I mean, societies evolve. Of course they do. They learn. This is the whole point. We can learn that certain strategies for playing, if you like, the game of life are better than other strategies. Right? Just like you can, when you have an artificial intelligence and you give it the task, learn to play chess, learn to play Go, right? Those minds, those programs, right, can find, they explore the space of possibilities and they can find winning strategies. They can learn, right? We can learn, societies can learn. We can learn that it's better not to repress homosexuals, right? It's better to say, let them enjoy their sex lives, right? It doesn't harm us, actually. And in fact, we can enjoy their company knowing that they're happy. I've got gay friends. They enjoy their sex lives, and I enjoy the fact that they are now. I've had a friend who was very repressed as a homosexual, right? And, I don't think he was happy in that repressed state. Then he came out, and now he's having lots of great sex, and he's enjoying his life, and I see that we have a better time as friends together because he's enjoying his life. So we can learn. Don't repress homosexuals.
And you grant that evolution could have made it so that we should kill them off because they're not reproducing couples.
No.
Evolution. You said evolution could have made it that way.
No, you're missing the point, right? Evolution can certainly create different things, okay? But what's
And the outcomes
it's
are
not.
somewhat
We're not
arbitrary.
claiming evolution gives us morality. We're saying morality has an evolutionary origin. The or and is happens in our minds. Okay, and there are certain things that minds can do. They can learn, right? So we can learn that certain things are better than others. I agree it's not inevitable that we will learn, right? But similarly, it's not inevitable that God will make it so that we all think that homosexuals should have rights.
I wanna
And in
refer-
fact, according to the Bible, they shouldn't have rights. So you, in your question, you said, you're painting these things as bad things, repressing homosexuals, but that's exactly what's in the Bible.
I want to affirm a couple things that you're saying and then add a clarification.
Okay, go ahead.
If by the evolving of morality, you're talking about, for example, learning and developmental adaptations of, say, if we have these values in place, regardless of where we got them, I think that's a moral law argument. I think that gets us back to God, but you don't grant that. But if we at least have them, we can formulate them in terms of policies and rules and behaviors. And if that's what you mean by an evolutionary source of morality or some facet of evolving morality, I can grant that.
Okay.
Also, the learning aspect, I have no issue with that. And I also grant that I'm not anti-intellectual when it comes to minds. I'm affirming the dignity of our mind. I think our minds can give us true knowledge about the real world. I think our minds can grasp real moral facts. I'm contending that in none of that have you actually bridged the is-ought problem and resolved how we get true facts, as opposed to just, my mind was made to do this by unthinking forces behind it.
How does appealing to a supernatural fact give you the is-ought problem, by the way, in 930?
Because you've got a mind at the basis of reality, and not just an evolved mind that has been monkeyed with by mindless evolutionary
if our morality comes from our minds, there's a mind at the basis of reality. So what's the difference?
Then you surrendered moral facts about how the world should be, and you're only talking about how you want things to be.
How is that different to how God wants things to be? I mean, he's a mind as well. You just said there's a mind at the bottom of reality.
Which God
if there's
are we talking about here? Remember,
your God.
We're talking about the Christian God.
Yeah.
Now, does the Christian God have anybody who came before him? That's an
Who
easy
knows?
question, right?
Because quite frankly, if you look at Jewish history, they start off with us. When you look at the
I'm not
Genesis, they
talking
talk
about
about
Jewish history.
we did
We're
it.
talking about
No, but
Christianity.
Christianity comes from Judaism. You can't separate
I'm talking about classical Christian theism. It sounds like you're not quite sure which character you're arguing.
I'm talking about the God of the Bible. I'm talking about the God that's described in the Bible.
Then let me ask.
One minute.
Okay, so my point was, which it sounds like you're blurring between different religions now. My point was, if we're talking about the Christian God as classical theism establishes him, there is no prior. We're talking about a first, a beginning of things. And this beginning of things is a necessary being, according to classical Christian theism. This thing is also a mind. So you at least have a sufficient originating grounding for the kinds of things that we encounter as moral facts. These are mental things about how things ought to be. We can contemplate hypothetical states. That's a mental kind of thing. So you need a mental basis for these kinds of things.
Okay,
God
that's
satisfies
one
that. A naturalistic evolution does not.
So basically, you're getting an ought from an is. You're basically saying the is God was the beginning.
I'm getting an
right?
ought from
So
a
you're
mind.
getting ought from is as well. There's
Oh, yeah.
no difference.
It's not a problem
There's no
if
difference.
your basis is
It doesn't make
teleological.
any difference.
If your basis is non-teleological, you don't have a... Teleology just means goal-orientedness. Goal-orientedness makes easy, ready sense for intelligent kinds of things, designed kinds of things. It's a lot harder to make that fit with non-designed, unintelligent kinds
There
of
are
things.
goals that we give ourselves, so there are still goals. It
Can you
makes
show
no
me a moral
difference.
fact that arises without a mind?
No, I think morals
Then
depend
my
on
point's
minds,
right.
but there are minds.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. For Q&A, just line up, or we can bring the mic to you. I think we can actually just bring the mic to you. You want it this one? Right here? Okay, cool. Oh, sorry. Sorry.
All right. Thanks, guys, so much for the debate. This has been really entertaining. John, my question is primarily to you. There was a part in your opening statement where you're talking about wolves and the reintroduction of wolves back into the habitat and how this predation really caused, even though it caused an increase in the suffering of the deer in that area, it ultimately led. Well,
Sleep response may have mitigated some of that, but I'll grant at least some.
some of them had their throats torn out, probably by the wolves. right?
And that some suffering I'm willing to grant.
Sure,
at least for the
sure.
sake of argument.
But for
They
it
do go passive.
sure.
Oftentimes with a fainting type response, which may suggest that they have shown a submissive response, fight, flight, or freeze as a submissive response, which
Okay.
at least in the case of tonic immobility seems to indicate a lack of any responsive conscious neural sensation, which means they may have died and they may have endured harm, but it's much less clear and not nearly as well demonstrated that
Right.
they didn't just experience pain, but they experienced suffering. And we're trying to find
Okay.
meaningless suffering, not
Sure.
just suffering. I grant suffering.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and so the full force of that story was to illustrate how there was something good that was brought about. That even though if there was pain and suffering, there was something really good. But later in your talk, you mentioned how because the two falls theodicy, as a result of the angelic fall and the satanic fall, that there were these effects of sin that were brought into the world, and these included things like predation. And so I'm just wondering,
Could.
yeah, but you included that as a specific example of something that was derived from sin.
That could have been a result of, say, satanic
Yeah.
influence, but God found a way to redeem.
So I'm just wondering, how do you resolve the characterization of predation being something that's good for the world, but also something that is derived from sin and something very, very horrible?
Okay. Can you state that question? State the last question.
So how do you? So it seems like there's the same thing that we're talking about. The predation is on the one hand a very, very good thing for the world, right? But on the other hand, it's the result of this horrible sin and rejection of God. So it seems like we need to square a circle someplace.
Can bad things be redeemed for good purposes on the other end of it?
I don't know. Is that what you're saying? That there's some
I'd say
redemption?
That's at least a preliminary response.
Okay.
I'm not going to put all my eggs in that basket. But the picture of Christian history is that there are a lot of bad things that have happened as a result of free will. So free will theodicy, free will is a great good. But those bad things, if they were to sort of be free radicals that spiraled into chaos and it was only meaningless harm that came from it, that would suggest that God's not real. But what we do find is instead the kind of 2 or 3 senses to any given event, that there are possible, even likely, goods that are coming as a result of it, even if that, I'm not saying that suffering is a good thing as suffering. I'm saying suffering can eventuate good things. And so I don't see where there's a contradiction to say that one thing is bad, but it can have good outcomes, good results, or be used for good.
Okay. Fair enough.
Okay. Thanks. Hi. Okay, so my name is Kevin. Yeah, thank you. I study metaethics, and so my question is going to be centered around that. Your name was John, and your name was Phil. Is that correct? All right. That's my question. Okay. No. So this question may require some sort of charitability because during the metaethical dispute, the terminology was sort of played with fast and loose, and so it was a bit difficult to grasp everything that was going on. But I would like to bring up the literature on evolutionary debunking arguments, and it does take some charitability because it was difficult to grasp what you were sort of how you were handling metaethics, and thus how you were responding to it. But at one point, you said something about the conflict between evolution and our capacity for moral knowledge, our ability to actually grasp true facts, true absolute moral facts. And so in my own, I don't know how good my sociological nose is, but in my own engagement with other metaethicists and with the literature, as near as I understand it, the evolutionary debunking argument, independent of theism, is largely not accepted. It's largely debunked. And I was just wondering how you would reply to that, how you would anticipate replies to the argument that evolution precludes accurate moral knowledge, reliable moral knowledge on
Which evolutionary debunking argument are you talking about? I've known several people who claim something akin to that, but I want to make sure I'm addressing the version you're talking about.
I would. I
Or
guess
maybe you
we can.
state or approximate a one-sentence statement of what it is.
My memory is not great, so that's going to be pretty difficult.
Yes, I'll try
But
to be charitable.
I guess I guess I would go with Vavova's the argument that if largely it sort of bears some resemblance to partners in crime arguments in favor of moral realism, in that Vavova says something like if we accept something like if we accept some premise like if we have no good reason to think that something is reliable, we shouldn't think it's reliable. That tends to lead to our rejection of knowledge about other things that have been evolutionarily selected for. So our faculties for mathematics or logic or reason or for science, etc.
Okay, that's a very complex question, and I haven't read Vavova, so I don't know that I can speak to it on task. I'm going to try to dignify what I think is the essence of it, but we can perhaps talk a little bit afterwards and clarify something.
That's fine.
I think when it comes to evolutionary debunking, morality, from what I can tell, at least in my own experience with it and the way I see other people interact with it, it seems to be pointing out or leaning upon some sort of transcendent reference point. But that's the kind of thing that makes sense if our minds aren't just brains. If our minds are just brains, then I don't know how we could have a transcendent reference point to say my mind is wrong right now or my mind is correct right now. We need to be able to think about thinking. And I don't know where you get that second level awareness so that our sophisticated mental life even makes sense on a naturalistic evolutionary model. So I'm not even granting that moral facts make sense given naturalistic evolution. And I may have an unpopular view, but I can point to a person or two in the literature that hold to it. Maybe I'm popular in that granting, but it's been a while since I did a review of the literature on that subtopic. I like meta-ethics, but I've covered a lot of different fields within ethics. So I don't grant that mind can come from non-mind, and I don't grant that moral facts can come from natural facts. Now, if you have a mind that did not come from non-mind but just was an uncaused cause, then you have the origin of things is sufficient already to give you moral facts. Because a mind, if you've got a perfect necessary mind, that's exactly what you would hope to expect if you need a perfect reference point for moral laws. Now, I generally avoid the moral law argument because it can oftentimes end up in quibbling over who's a sufficient moral authority and could God have done things differently. I don't think God could have made the moral values underneath our laws different than what they are because I think they're true of Him, and they are facts in that sense. But if I don't grant mind and I don't grant that evolution is a sufficient cause, because I tend to favor the evolutionary argument against naturalism too, if that helps clarify where I stand on that.
Okay.
All right, thank
All right. Thank you.
And are we going to go back and forth on these? I thought we were going to have.
Well, I think we want to have time for the questioners. I mean, I'm happy to go back and forth.
Yeah.
But let's make the questioners a priority.
We have 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Tajiri. I'm a member of the local Ratio Christi chapter, which is like campus apologetics group. My question is directed towards Phil.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the moral argument is not relevant to the discussion because both you and the theist agree that meaningless animal suffering is wrong. However, this discounts that the theist derives his or her moral standard from God, who as the creator of life is also the definer of its value. Could you help me understand on what basis you claim the authority or knowledge to distinguish right or wrong to the point where any deviances from the morality you are proposing would be factually wrong rather than a difference in opinion or preferred method?
Okay. So to me, you cannot escape your own judgment. You have to be able to, because the Christian is claiming that God is the basis for objective morality, God exists, God is perfectly good, God is perfectly powerful, you cannot escape the fact that you have to assess whether those claims are true or false. So you're saying, how do I base my judgment, if I don't have God? But I have to be able to assess whether God is true in order to assess whether, God can be the grounding of moral facts. So you cannot escape your own judgment. There's no way out of that. Even if you are a theist, you are judging that God is good, just like I'm judging that God is bad. And the reason I'm saying it's irrelevant to this argument is because the topic for the debate is about the Christian God. So even if you were to grant the moral argument, that would not give you any reason to think that all of the apparent immorality in the Bible, the torture of animals, would be justifiable, even if you granted the moral argument. And you also talk about moral facts, and you can talk about morality without asserting that they are facts. You could say morality is subjective. That doesn't mean that all statements about morality is meaningless. Just like I could say rainbows are beautiful. Do I have to have an objective fact of the matter about what is beautiful and what isn't? No, I can still make that statement. And if other people agree with me, if they share my moral sentiments, my moral intuitions, or my aesthetic intuitions, we can make shared statements. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, sorry. The statement about the rainbow wouldn't be a moral statement.
No, it wouldn't. My whole point is, it's not a meaningless statement.
Okay.
Okay. So I think you're trying to say, if it's not a moral fact, then it's a meaningless statement. I think.
Not
is that where you're going with
necessarily.
the argument?
It's more of that in saying that suffering is wrong, and therefore a good God cannot permit suffering of animals. I'm personally under the assumption that you would have to impose a moral law in order to make that statement, and that statement you would not be able to impose a moral law without a theistic reference, because it would be based on an opinion and not a fact.
Okay, so when you say impose a moral law, to me I would just say I need to make a moral judgment. And of course, no one can escape the fact that they have to make judgments on these questions about the existence of God, and even if God does exist, is it the Christian God? You cannot escape the fact that you have to make judgments. And those judgments will be imperfect. You have to use your head and try and make a decision. Same in morality. So I don't think you need to use the language of I have to impose a moral law that I have to get from God. And even if you did have to impose a moral law, why does God give you a moral law? I just don't see that. He's a mind like I'm a mind. And the fact that he's first, John's argument seems to be saying, well, God is the first mind. And to that, I would ask 4 important questions. Yeah, and so what?
Oh, sorry. It was kind of in my question halfway. The assumption is that because God is the creator, he is therefore the definer of our value, and therefore he would be able to say what is right and wrong in terms of what is a violation of our value. And so that's what places him in authority to say this is right and this is wrong because this is mine.
Okay, so basically it's saying you're also getting an ought from an is. The is in this case is God as the creator. Now I don't see any reason to say that because I create something, I'm morally, the authority on everything that it does. If I have children, or my parents gave birth to me, right, they are not able to say to me, this is right, this is wrong. The fact that they created me, to me, is irrelevant. So I just don't see that creation gives you this objective basis that you seek.
Sorry, that's reproduction, not creation.
It's creation. What's the difference?
Okay.
Something from nothing, nothing.
Okay,
We can talk about it
Okay, sure.
Hi. So my
Thanks
name
for the
is.
question,
What's your name?
Oh, my name is Bobby. I'm a recent philosophy grad. I'm a Catholic, and my question is for John.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems as a theist, we kind of always find ourselves, on the defensive when it comes to issues of suffering. So going along with something that Aquinas might say, existence in itself, seems to be a type of good. So why not just say, that suffering in itself is like a degree of good, in and of itself, because it is existence. So like, why not just say like, because like take for example,
Better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. The pain of a lost love is a kind of good, even though we're not saying that the pain itself is good.
Right.
There's some testimony of it that still points us to good things.
Right. Well,
Okay.
I was going to use like a bit more extreme example. Like for example, like let's just take hell for example. So like for example,
Thanks for the
like nobody
slow pitch.
like
God.
All the easy
I
questions.
expected from the atheist. Man.
but like nobody.
Or the Catholic giving you hell questions.
Like nobody
No,
wants
go
to,
ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so like nobody wants to go to hell, but can we say like this is a type of good in and of itself? Because it's like, God like rooting out his justice. Like it's a type of good that you would want to experience, but couldn't we at least say that this suffering is a type of good? And if so, then couldn't we just say that, all suffering to some degree is a type of good, even though it's, maybe not one that we might not want to experience?
To add some critical clarifications, I don't want to be in the position of saying that suffering as such is good. I think we need to distinguish between ontological good and moral good. One of the classical teachings within the Christian church is that being is good, that existence is good, that there's basic kinds of good that Genesis 1, God looks at creation before there's intelligent life on it and says it's good. So there has to be some sense of goodness that's operating before there were human minds, or even potentially even angelic minds. I don't know. And so there's kinds of good there. For aesthetic values might be comparable or a category of ontological kinds of good. So that if, for example, a painting in a hidden painting, no one knows what's in this box, and it's destroyed in a museum fire. Now, let's say the person who made it, the only person who knew, he died long ago. The museum curator doesn't realize it's there. Have we lost something good with regard to that painting? Assuming it wasn't total trash, then we have lost something good. And that's a kind of good. And it might be that we could talk about levels of existence that are anguish, that have a substrate of goodness going on, but we have to include, say, Augustine's knowledge or idea that privation is the key component whereby we understand what evil is. Evil is a privation of good. It's a lack of good. But if you had maximal evil, you no longer have good. Evil needs a host to even exist. So illustration. Okay, I'll be quick. So to illustrate it, what do you have if you've got a coat that's been entirely eaten by moths? You've got a hanger, you don't have a coat anymore. Or a car that's been entirely eaten by rust. You don't have a car, you've got a parking spot. You have to have a substrate of good whereby evil can exist. And perhaps we can understand some ontological goodness that enables hell. But there's a really long response to it that I don't have time to. I'd love to talk with you afterwards about that.
Okay, thanks, Bobby.
All right, thank you.
All right, I'm getting to the point where I have to kind of like really start. So just make sure your questions are just shorter than
Yeah, I
the
have to defend hell in 30 seconds or less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My question's relatively short. So
Okay.
my name is Seth,
Thanks, Seth.
and it's directed towards John. You essentially, when you're talking about animal pain, define pain as a rather functional thing to removes one from stimuli.
That's one aspect.
Yeah. But it's just, you kind of say that due to some prefrontal cortex deficiency, they don't have the quale of pain. But it seems
Some of them.
Yeah,
I allow that some may.
It seems that quale is almost an essential property of pain, and that when I have an experience, if I don't have that quale, I'm not going to have the reaction that I have. So how are you defining pain? What are the essential
I told you it would
qualities
come
of
up.
it? And how do you get around the problem that quale seems to be an essential property of pain?
Phil and I went back and forth on this for a while over the terminology, because I found that his use of the term pain loosely went from first order pain and suffering, which is the ability to reflect on your pain, to think about your suffering. The suffering aspect can allow other complexities to it. But we could call that higher order pain. That I myself don't find the pain of fish to qualify as suffering in any significant sense. Now, we're still responsible for trying to minimize pain, but it doesn't have the same moral weight as, say, a gorilla that seems to have conscious awareness of a self and has a sense of self with a qualitative experience of what it feels like to be that ape, or Thomas Nagel's reference, what's it like to be a bat. So qualia, I understand to be part of pain, but also part of suffering. It's not necessarily part of all nociception, which is, you might call it the physiological substrate, whereby most, or at least a lot of pain is sensed within animals and humans. So nociception isn't exclusively a pain receptor, though. You can have a nociceptive response without any experience. Oh, I'm in pain, because you could be asleep and have a nociceptive response and have no conscious qualitative experience, but you still jerk back from the pain, because there still seems to be a subconscious or unconscious nociceptive response that doesn't include qualia. So I understand nociception as, you might say, category 1, pain is category 2, and then suffering is category 3. I don't think Phil grants those categories, but I've run into them too much in the literature to leave them out in my reading of it.
Okay, just one clarification. So you're saying that higher order forms of suffering are more, they're essentially more evil, correct? They carry a heavier moral weight.
They can.
Okay.
Well, the problem of animal suffering is the carefully chosen term we agreed on, so that we don't get caught up in saying all pain counts. Well, it has to be meaningless suffering, or for your case, great pain, as opposed to a little pain stubbing your toe. No one considers that to be a real strong argument against God's existence. The suffering of starfish is not terribly interesting to this problem. But if we're talking about mass extinction events, we're getting closer to something of real substance. But frankly, if we could maintain biodiversity and organize orderly, consequential, ecological system, and yet get rid of every single mosquito, I would vote for that. I would be fine with an extinction event if it meant getting rid of mosquitoes, because they love me, but I hate them.
All right, okay, thank you.
Hi, my name's Alexandria, and my question's for John. Before I ask my main question, I just wanted clarification on one point. Would you say animal suffering is a result or another consequence of a sinful and fallen world?
Yes, and. I'm willing to grant, according to the natural law theodicy, or what's called the gnomic regularity theodicy, that at least some suffering could have existed in a way that still raises enough evidential problem that this question is legitimate. But I do grant that a lot, perhaps all, animal suffering can be traced to either human or angelic agency.
Okay. You also stated earlier that one thing humans ultimately need to learn, that sinning is stupid. Mm-hmm. If animal suffering is a part of that sin and fallen world, which would include when humans enact it, such as consuming and hunting animals, would you then agree that it should be considered a sin and thus against God's nature when we do enact suffering? Likewise,
So I'm going to repeat your question back to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. So would I grant that meat eating, is it a sin, or should we treat it as a sin? Okay, so from my worldview, within Christian theism, would I grant that? Okay, within Christian doctrine, I think it's Genesis 9, meat eating is given permission for human beings. From Genesis 1 through 8, according to a fairly, plain, you might say, conservative reading of the text, humans eating meat was prohibited. I don't consider meat eating to be ideal, and I think there's biblical grounds for that. Heaven is described in such a way that it's a fair theological inference from Scripture to say that heaven won't have any meat eating either. So if we're talking about ideals, I don't think it's ideal. Relative to that ideal, I think it's a sin. relative to the current, you might say, dispensation that we're in, we're given that permission. And I would say it's at least a concession in cases of great poverty, where the vegetation has been so overgrazed and people are in just destitute situation. I won't fault a person who eats meat so that they can survive, because I think the human life is substantially more valuable than the animal life. But that's not saying that animal lives have no value. I'm saying human lives are more valuable. And I think from a biblical standpoint, God gave animals for our service. And that can include domesticating them, and it can include farming. And in principle, that can at least allow for meat eating, but I'm not at all going to argue that that's part of God's ideal plan, because biblically, I don't think it is.
So just to clarify, it would be more so called a sin on practical grounds rather than moral grounds?
What do you mean by sin?
More so that because it includes animal suffering, that it's against God's nature.
Okay, against God's nature. It would, if God's nature were merely about pleasure, maximizing pleasure, reducing pain, under that rubric, then it would be strictly against God's nature. There are ways it's against God's nature. There's ways it's permitted if we're talking about justice. The key twist that I think Christian and biblical theism needs to understand is that the animal suffering is a consequence of sin. We need to have great responsibility right now practicing and learning it so that we can appreciate what that sacrificial system means. That's what sin looks like. We should be ashamed of that. We should be embarrassed about that. It's not a sin to treat sin. It's actually an awful outcome of our sin. And in that sense, it's tied to sin. And it's a reflection, it's what we can expect given a fallen world when we misuse our freedom. Instead of learning everything the way we should have so that we acquire moral knowledge without having to cheat, without having to defy God to do it. And we can learn through great consequential actions in this world. We might have had a system that just kind of blossomed until heaven happened on earth. That's biblically what there's a theological case to make for that. Because Adam and Eve were supposed to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. They weren't just supposed to stay in the garden and do it. So potentially there wouldn't have been any death. But in this dispensation, where God has to teach us a lesson given new criteria, animal suffering is in some cases the expedient, the secondary way to try to recover some sort of learning that we need to gain about the awfulness of our sin.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
My name's Dylan.
Nice
My
to
question
meet you,
goes out to John. I know you're being a little berated here. No, but this was more of a focus on an argumentative analysis. You brought up the term, and it might have been for an example, but rubric. And I noticed there's a lot of shoulds in a lot of these statements, a lot of shoulds, and that we should look at sin this way. And I just want to understand how, and contradictory to that, earlier you stated about theology, there's a wrong way or a poor way to go about theology. And it seems
procedural goods and evils, you might say.
But it seems like contradictory to what like a rubric is, which is very set guidelines. A lot of this seems to be interpretive. And so I don't understand where we would distinct between how correct our interpretation is and what God's plan is. It just seems difficult to make the argument.
Can you boil that down to one single question? I want to make sure I'm answering exactly what you're saying.
Where do we draw the line between our own interpretation and what the natural or what God's moral plan or moral fact is?
Where do we draw the line between our own interpretation and God's moral facts? I believe we've got, I'm a realist. Now, what you asked is at the heart of epistemology in general. That's the kind of question that people have been asking for thousands of years. I don't expect to solve it in 30 seconds, but I'll try to at least show it some respect here. I believe we have at least approximately reliable moral knowledge and interaction with the real world. We can identify facts. I'm a realist, and I think the best way to account for the reliability of our mental faculties is that matter and mere nature, mere evolution, are not all that exists. I think the best way to account for that is that mind is more basic than matter. Hence, our minds have a prior mind, whereby our minds haven't been tampered with by an unthinking, unguiding, red in tooth and claw kind of process, that its outcomes, they're not arbitrary with respect to, say, things that work relative to survival value, but they are arbitrary in that things could have turned out radically different than what we consider to be moral facts. So I think we do have approximate intellectual ability to transcend and think about our thinking. And from that point, we can say whether we're thinking correctly and whether we're thinking incorrectly. That's a transcendent reference point. Now some emergent theorists try to say we can get a transcendent reference point from nature so that we can critique our own thinking. But I don't know how you get mind as an emergent property or an emergent behavior from nature without falling back into the circularity problem. My mind is correct according to my mind. My brain is correct according to my brain. Well, if our minds are able to access, and I can go into some Thomistic epistemology because I'm a fan of Thomas Aquinas and his philosophy. I think we can access things that are just plain true regardless of our interpretation. So, for example, first laws of logic. Do we have to so A equals A. A thing is itself. That is a logical fact. There's no way to refute it because any effort to refute it, you have to imply it. So we've got at least logical first principles. We could also deal with mathematical first principles. These can be discovered as such. But if at any point that requires a transcendent ability to think about our sensate activity in the world, then you have now employed a transcendent leverage point, which I don't know that nature qualifies for. Now, maybe it does, but I haven't been convinced that that's even possible given only non-mental starting points.
Cool. Hi, I'm Jason. I'm an education major.
Nice to meet you, Jason.
I have a question for both of you, but I feel like you've been talking a lot, so
Thank you.
I'd like your response first, actually. We've talked about like the Canaanite massacres and such, and so I'm kind of curious, would you say that in general our American or English society, or whichever society you'd like to, is more moral than that society? Like our moral laws are better than their moral laws in this context compared to them in their context? And then second, and related to that, would you say that you are more moral than, say, him or someone else? And then my real question, what I'm really interested in, is what criteria do you use to evaluate that? I actually am interested in what you both have to say. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. So how do you assess what is moral and what is not moral? Right. Is that essentially?
Yeah. Okay. And then applied.
And then apply it to the Canaanite massacre and so on and so forth. I'm not going to answer, am I more moral than him? Because I don't know very well. We've had a few chats on Skype, so I can't really answer that one. But I can say, how do you assess what's moral and what's not moral? You use two things, your moral instincts and your reason. And those two things combined give you your morality. Okay? You can't escape either of those two things. Okay? So to me, when I look at the Canaanite massacre, my moral instincts tell me that's wrong. And I can look at reasons, justifications that people give to it. And I've gone through those justifications. So, a lot of theologians have come up with justifications like the Canaanites were evil, they had to be killed to preserve Israel, to found blah, blah, blah. And none of that seems to work, in particular because the animals were all wiped out. So whatever you think the flaws were in the Canaanite society that meant they had to be wiped out, which I find sickening, right? It can't apply to the animals. So I'm using my reason and I'm using my moral instincts. Okay, and I think you can't escape that. And if I'm being presented with the claim God is all good and all powerful, and not just there is a all powerful, all good God, but it's that one in the Bible, then I can't escape the fact that I have to reason as best I can. And of course I could be mistaken, right? But that's all you can do. Appealing to God as a source of some objective morality is, to me, a false get-out, because there's no reason at all why, just because God is the first being or is all-powerful. I mean, power corrupts, so why doesn't absolute power corrupt absolutely? There's no reason at all to think that even if there is this immaterial mind that created us, that he should be perfectly good. So I just don't see that line of reasoning works.
So using that criteria, instinct and rationale, you would say you are more moral than the person who wrote those commandments, the human that wrote.
That's my judgment, but you can't escape your own judgment. I know you might be thinking, who's he to judge? but we all have to judge. You cannot escape your own judgment.
And to speak to that, you said for both of us,
Sure.
I think we have basic moral knowledge that is somehow built into us, and that gives us at least a starting ground for starting to make some morally true inferences about how things should be, not just how I feel, but we're discerning about extra mental reality that is not part of any of our mental opinion, but we're dealing in the real world, how it ought to be. So I think a lot of that's just built in. One of the great benefits, I think, of a Christian worldview is that you've got kind of like this fully furnished house with moral fixtures, many of which have been well worked over by theologians and critics over many centuries, and it's a well-furnished house. Now, we can disagree over how big it is and which rooms are really Christianity and which ones aren't. Is that schismatic or heretical? We can disagree on all that, but it's at least a furnished house. Meanwhile, with secular atheism, as opposed to, say, like a religious form of atheism, which does happen, like forms of Buddhism. If you're a secular atheist and all you have is nature and evolutionary processes filtering all of your judgments so that your moral judgments are always coerced by a big bully that is red in tooth and claw, I don't know that allows us to have trustworthy judgments, morally speaking. Moreover, when you test out to see, he granted evolution is is value neutral. Evolution isn't good or evil. Evolution just is. It's doing what it's going to do. I think when you really press it, when you really test this out, and you apply skepticism fairly and broadly, and don't just get selective about it. Oh, I'm selective in skepticism about theism or Christianity or whatever. If you really apply it, I think you end up with something that looks a lot more like Nietzsche and a nihilistic landscape. So compared to the fully furnished house, you've got a barren wasteland. Now, most atheists are reasonably moral. They bring some moral knowledge with them, which I would expect if we have natural laws programmed into our hearts. But I don't think they got that from the barren wasteland. I think that's smuggled in from the house.
Okay, so this is for John.
Of course.
So early on, you were saying that in an atheistic frame, I'm glad you just mentioned Buddhism just now, because as you probably know, even though there are gods in Buddhism, they all die and suffer. So there's no sort of creator god in Buddhism, right?
Okay.
Yet,
well, at least there's none stipulated. The Buddha, you might.
Well, later versions of Mahayana Buddhism.
No, I'm talking about. Talking about Siddhartha Gautama. I'm talking about Sakyamuni Buddha.
Yes, there's no creator god.
He was asked whether there's a god, and he said, "I'm not interested in that question."
Yes, that's right. But that's
it's agnosticism, not atheism, in a sense. He's like, I don't know.
Yeah,
maybe,
he said those are. He said those.
They don't assert that there is a God.
Agreed. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I grant that it's a kind of atheism. Yeah.
Look, those are the so-called like irrelevant questions in Buddhism. Like, is the universe eternal? Is it not? And the usual interpretation of those early texts is to say, well, he was dealing with a specific person who was,
that's one way to take it.
Needing metaphysics. And the way the doctrine was developed, though, was explicitly denying a creator God.
Okay.
So there's a great book called Against a Hindu God, in particular against, what was the name? Anyway, I forget the Ishvara.
Your point's well taken.
Okay, so nonetheless, they believe in objective morality inscribed in the universe by the law of karma. And they believe you can be acquainted with intrinsically bad and intrinsically good states, and that those therefore give you oughts, like this is bad and is to be avoided, and you know that by acquaintance, right? So in one sense, it's not a naturalistic story in one sense, the way we usually understand it. In another sense, it's quite a naturalistic story with an objective morality that does not have a creator God. So that's just a comment. So the question,
if you're going to ask a question,
it's not predicated on that comment.
Well, but the comment I need to be able to respond to, because you end up.
Okay, go ahead.
If you want to debate, you've got the privilege to it.
Go ahead.
To comment on that, I don't grant that karma is ultimately a very morally responsible doctrine. When
it's about equivalent to the will of God.
Can I respond to your
yes.
comment? the doctrine of karma, I take serious issue with. I'll set that aside for a second and say, if you're going to appeal to Buddhism as an example of how an atheist can grant moral facts, then you just appeal to a broadly pantheistic or panentheistic worldview, depending on which brand you hold to, that allows that as an option, and is also very superstitious about the way nature operates. I've got a.
So is Christianity.
I've got a brother who
its
is.
history. Yeah.
Hold on.
Okay.
Yeah. Who is in China right now, and he's married to a Chinese woman, and so I get a little access into how Chinese culture is interpreted from a Chinese standpoint. Now, it's still 2 or 3 persons removed through me, through my brother, through her, but to think that it's naturalistic, it would be a misunderstanding.
I said it's naturalistic in one sense, it's not naturalistic in another sense.
Okay, then I agree with you. Yeah.
Okay.
But it's a very teleological understanding of the way the world works, and you can get that if you drop the premises that lead to pantheism or panentheism, but you don't draw the conclusion of now pantheism. If you stop short of the conclusion of those premises, then you can feel rationally justified. But I think you're stopping short.
No, the point is just there's an example of a kind of system that has, it's got many variations, it has various degrees of articulation. So
If that form of Buddhism were true, I think naturalistic atheism would be false.
Let's get to that.
anyway, sorry, the point is just there is such a system that gives you a motive, it has an objective morality. You can argue about its ontology, but so can you about the Christian one and so on. Anyway,
Right.
just because early on you kind of presented as if an atheistic system couldn't possibly do this, but yes, it can. We can argue about whether it really works or not, but that's beside the point. The second question I had for you was, at some point you compared the Amalekites to ISIS.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of the implication of what I thought you said was something like, so it was okay, it was like morally justified for the Israelites to go and kill the babies, kill the infants, kill the kids, just because they're
And the animals.
And the animals. Sorry, did I leave out the animals? And because they had been having sex with the animals, we got to kill the animals. Puppies too? Were they stabbing puppies and so on? Right? I don't know. But it just sounds outrageous. And wouldn't it be better, let me ask you this, what if the story had gone a different way? God just softened the hearts of all the Amalekites. The converse way just to Pharaoh when Pharaoh
at the compromise of free will, yes, that's a possibility.
That's fine. Who cares about free will?
I care a whole lot about free will.
But why did he harden Pharaoh's
But anyway.
heart?
Okay.
I mean, you can't have it both
we can talk about
ways.
that later.
Okay,
But
so
I just want to let me just finish
This
the
question is getting
the
really
question,
long. I'd like to be able to respond.
Here's the
Because
question.
I'll lose track.
Wouldn't it have been better had God just changed the hearts of the Canaanites instead of having the Israelites go slaughter the babies and puppies and everything and heal everybody? Just like you wouldn't like it, I hope you don't think that it's okay for the United States military or whoever to go in and slaughter the children in areas held by ISIS. Do you think that's okay?
With all due respect, the question turned into a
tirade.
A tirade.
Okay.
And I understand this is a very emotionally charged something. One of the concerns I have about the use of emotion in this kind of setting is
go ahead.
This is very important because I'm not just trying to shush you because I don't have an answer. I've got responses to it, but for the sake of an audience. It's a very emotional charge something, and I want to be very careful that we don't let that trigger a fight or flight response in us where we start getting all excited and worked up, and then our frontal brain starts to shut down because we go back to midbrain, and our fight or flight response.
We're going to go have a beer after this.
Sir, please. Please.
Yeah, let's.
Our fight or flight response tends to make it so that we're not being honest in evaluating evidence because our executive function reverts back to a more primal function. So this is a practical reason I'm concerned about it. I'm not trying to squelch you. I think you've got a very good question.
Okay,
it's a really interesting question. You said, wouldn't it be better if God had trumped their free will and softened their hearts or something like that? Okay. If that were the only situation we're concerned about, maybe that's a possibility. But would it be justified to destroy a civilization that has every potential, historically speaking, to regrow? And it actually did, and led to the slaughter of many more people for hundreds of years afterwards. Now, I think we have to remember, it's not just about pain and pleasure. It's about preparing a people that will rule and reign in heaven for eternity and yet never use their free will. And the free will itself is a great value. Now you've got 3 or 4 different sub-questions regarding animal suffering, say women that weren't involved in the military combat, and then children.
And the
one,
animals.
I mentioned
And the animals.
the animals, yes.
You've got the puppies that hadn't been.
I responded to this already. I might have rushed past it, so it didn't really sink in. Plunder and pillage is a bad reason to go to war. De-incentivizing warfare is still an important point, even if it's done in such a way that means devastation. At least if we've got a people that are going to be used by God, who, by the way, aren't necessarily morally superior in the long run, they're an instrument of God. Biblically, they may not have been morally superior. They were picked because they weren't great. So destroying the civilization constitutes justice after they had 400 years to repent. Great responsibility, as I talked about in the Imago Dei Theodicy and in the Two False Theodicy, helps explain why we can have consequential behavior that's over a whole realm. Because if we're going to accept the blessings of others that did things that we didn't deserve, then we have to at least accept that there can be drawbacks for that. Reparations is a small-scale example, but there can also be warfare that for example, if a ruling class were to start a war and initiate the killing of lots of people, it is appropriate to fight back, even knowing that there may be civilian casualties, even knowing that there will be animals that are destroyed, because it was a war of aggression. There's a sense of justice here that you have to account for in your system that is equally fit. So we're not sacrificing justice, we're not sacrificing free will, we're not sacrificing the great good of natural law and natural order. And I don't think you've really taken that into account, because there's a strong, a valid but an incomplete sentiment regarding what's morally good. Respond to that in there.
Don't you think Abraham was a whack job back then? Anyway.